Welcome to Sheriff Files. Please like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where are you watching from tonight. Get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. I counted 7 missing cars last winter. No skid marks. No debris. Nothing. That's what I told the state boys when they finally decided to grace our little corner of nowhere with their presence. 7 cars, gone like smoke on a still morning. They looked at me the way you look at an old dog that started pissing on the furniture, with that mixture of pity and impatience that says your time is just about up. Been sheriff of Millbrook Township for 38 years now. Seen my share of peculiar things in that time. Drunks who walk through closed doors. Hunters who find deer strung up in trees they swear were empty the day before. Once had a woman call about her dead husband mowing the lawn. Turned out she was right, too, though we never did figure out how a man 3 days buried managed to finish the back 40 with a push mower. But this business with the cars, this was different. This had teeth. The road in question, we just called it the Hollow Road, though the county maps labeled it Township Route 47, ran for about 6 miles through some of the emptiest country you'd ever want to see. Started at the crossroads near Ezra Hutchins' old place, and wound through a stretch of woods so thick the sun barely touched ground even at high noon. The trees pressed in close on both sides, mostly oak and maple, but older than they had any right to be. Older than the township itself, my grandfather used to say. The road dipped down into what locals called the hollow about 3 miles in. Nothing dramatic, just a gentle depression where the land folded in on itself like a sleeping giant's palm. On the right side, there was a ditch. Shallow thing, maybe 2 feet deep and perhaps 4 feet wide at its broadest point. In spring, when the snow melted, it would carry off runoff from the hills. Rest of the year, it was just a dry scratch in the earth, lined with smooth stones that looked too uniform, too purposeful to be natural. Nobody thought much about that ditch until the cars started disappearing. First one was Melanie Kowalski's blue Honda. She'd been driving back from her sister's place in Brennan Falls on a Tuesday evening in early December. Next morning, her husband Pete called to report her missing. We found the Honda 3 days later, or what was left of it, buried nose first in that shallow ditch like someone had taken a giant thumb and pressed it straight down into the earth. But here's the thing that bothered me from the start. The car was 8 feet deep in a ditch that had never been more than 2 feet. I stood there in the cold morning air, watching Kowalski's bumper peek up through the dirt like a metal gravestone, and felt something cold crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the December wind. The state investigators figured it was some kind of sinkhole. Said the limestone beneath our soil was probably honeycombed with caverns, and the weight of the car had triggered a collapse. They had diagrams and geological surveys and all manner of official explanations that sounded real good when you heard them in the warm coffee shop down at Mabel's. Didn't explain where Melanie had gone, though. We dug for the better part of a week. Brought in machinery, lights, the whole circus. Found the car, sure enough. Found her purse, still sitting on the passenger seat like she just stepped out for a moment. Found her shoes, both of them, placed neatly on the dashboard as if she'd decided to make herself comfortable for a long drive. Never found her. The second car went missing 3 weeks later. Old Timothy Marsh's pickup truck, the same road, the same ditch. This time we were ready. Had the excavator on site within 6 hours. Timothy's F-150 was down there, all right, another 8 feet under an earth that had been solid as bedrock the day before. Timothy's jacket was hanging on the rearview mirror. His coffee cup, still half full, sat in the center console. The radio was tuned to the country station out of Albany, volume turned down low, playing some lonesome song about highways and leaving. No Timothy. By the time the third car vanished, Jenny Morrison's little red Volkswagen, The state had sent down a whole team of experts. Geologists, engineers, a thin man with thick glasses who claimed to be some kind of specialist in subsurface anomalies. They set up instruments along the hollow road, sensors and cameras and machines that hummed like angry insects in the winter silence. They monitored that stretch of road for 2 solid weeks. Their equipment registered nothing unusual. Soil density remained constant. No seismic activity. No changes in ground temperature or moisture content. According to their instruments, that section of the hollow road was as stable as any piece of ground in the county. Then their van disappeared. I'll never forget the morning I got that call. Sarah Kelman from the township office, voice pitched high with something between confusion and fear. "Sheriff, you need to get out to the hollow road. The state van is gone." I drove out there expecting to find tire tracks, maybe signs they packed up and left without telling anybody. Instead, I found their van buried in the same ditch, same 8-foot depth, same impossible neatness. The back doors were standing wide open, and all their expensive equipment was still there, still humming and blinking like electronic prayer candles in the half-light. The thin man with the thick glasses was sitting in the driver's seat, but only parts of him. His hands were folded in his lap, his shoes were placed carefully on the passenger side floorboard, and his glasses were hanging from the rearview mirror. Everything else was simply gone. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with sinkholes. The state pulled their people out after that. Oh, they had explanations, always had explanations. Equipment malfunction, personnel reassignment, budget constraints. But I could see it in their eyes when they spoke to me. That careful blankness that comes when people encounter something that doesn't fit in their neat categories of possible and impossible. They put up barriers at both ends of the affected stretch, officially closing the road for geological instability. Put up signs warning of dangerous conditions, though they didn't specify what kind of danger. Just made the hollow road officially off-limits, and pretended that solved the problem. It didn't. Cars 4, 5, and 6 disappeared over the next 2 months. Folks who ignored the barriers, who figured they knew the road better than any government sign. Each time, same result, 8 feet down in a 2-foot ditch, personal effects arranged with an almost ceremonial precision, no sign of the drivers. The 7th car belonged to my own deputy, Marcus Webb. Marcus had been with the department for 6 years. Good kid, steady hands, the kind of officer who actually read the incident reports instead of just filing them away. He'd been as troubled by the disappearances as I was, spent his own time researching the history of the hollow road, digging through county records and old newspaper clippings. He'd found some interesting things. The road had been built in 1923, following the path of an older wagon trail that dated back to the 1850s. Before that, the trail had followed an even older Indian path. Local Seneca had a name for the area that roughly translated as, "where the earth dreams." They'd considered it sacred ground, but not the good kind of sacred. The kind you stayed away from unless you had business with things that weren't quite alive and weren't quite dead. Marcus had also found records of disappearances going back decades. Not cars, obviously, but people. Hunters who never came home. Travelers whose wagons were found empty on the trail, belongings undisturbed, horses still in their traces but shying away from something that wasn't there. The records were incomplete, scattered across different jurisdictions and time periods, but Marcus had put together a pattern. Every few years, someone would vanish in the hollow. Always the same area, always without a trace. The only consistency was the location and the strange, careful arrangement of abandoned belongings. He'd been planning to present his findings to me on a Monday morning in February. Instead, I got a call from his wife Sunday night. Marcus hadn't come home from what he'd called a routine patrol. I found his cruiser at dawn, buried in the ditch like all the others. His duty belt was coiled neatly on the passenger seat. His badge was pinned to the sun visor. His gun was in its holster, service weapon secure, safety on, just the way he'd been trained to leave it. His coffee was still warm. That's when I stopped making official reports about the Hollow Road. What was the point? The state didn't want to hear it, the county couldn't handle it, and the townspeople had already started pretending the whole thing was just a run of bad luck. People are good at forgetting things that make them uncomfortable, especially in small towns where comfort is about the only luxury anyone can afford. But I couldn't forget Marcus Webb sitting there in that buried cruiser with his hands folded and his shoes off, and that terrible, careful precision in how everything was arranged. Like someone, or something, was trying to make him comfortable for a very long journey. I started driving the Hollow Road myself after that. Not the affected section, of course. Just the approaches, the places where the barriers stood like metal scarecrows against whatever lived in that shallow ditch. I'd park at the edges of the restricted zone and listen to the silence that wasn't quite silence. Watch the way the shadows fell wrong even on cloudless days. The ditch was always empty now. Smooth stones arranged in patterns that might have been natural but probably weren't, dry earth that never seemed to hold footprints or tire tracks for more than a few hours. Sometimes I'd see birds start to fly over that section of road, then veer away at the last moment, as if they'd hit an invisible wall. Sometimes I'd hear humming. Not human humming. Something deeper, more rhythmic, like the sound a power line makes in winter wind, but there were no power lines anywhere near the Hollow Road. The sound seemed to come from the earth itself, rising and falling in patterns that reminded me of breathing. On clear nights, when the moon was dark and the stars were hidden behind clouds, I'd see lights moving beneath the ground. Soft, blue-white glows that pulsed in time with that underground humming, drifting along the length of the ditch like lanterns carried by very patient travelers. I never reported any of this, of course. Never told another soul until now. What would be the point? Who would believe that the earth itself had developed an appetite? That something old and patient and eternally hungry had found a way to feed on the people who passed through its territory? But I knew, and knowing changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I stopped sleeping well. Started checking my rearview mirror constantly when I drove, looking for that telltale glimpse of blue-white light that might mean my time was up. Began leaving my shoes by the door each night, lined up neat and straight, just in case whatever lived in the Hollow Road decided it was ready for me. Because I'd figured out the pattern, you see. The shoes, the folded hands, the personal effects arranged with such care. It wasn't random. It was preparation. Someone or something was making those people ready for a journey, helping them transition from one state of being to another. The question wasn't whether they were dead or alive down there in the dark. The question was what they were becoming. I retired 2 years after Marcus disappeared, turned my badge over to a young officer from the county seat who promised to keep an eye on things. Told him the official story about geological instability and dangerous conditions, but I could see in his eyes that he knew there was more to it. Small-town sheriffs develop an instinct for the unspoken truths that live in the spaces between what happened and what people are willing to admit happened. The barriers are still up on the Hollow Road. The county has plans to eventually repair the subsurface damage and reopen the route, but somehow those plans never seem to make it out of committee. Budget issues, they say. Environmental concerns. Bureaucratic red tape. The real reason is simpler. Nobody wants to be the one who gives that ditch another chance to feed. But feeding isn't really the right word for what happens there. Feeding implies consumption, destruction, and ending. What happens on the Hollow Road is more like collection. Gathering. The careful preservation of something essential while everything unnecessary is gradually, gently discarded. I drive past the barriers sometimes, even now. Usually in the early morning hours when the mist rises from the trees and the air has that quality of waiting that comes just before dawn. I park at the edge of the restricted zone and listen to the silence that isn't silence. Watch for the blue-white lights that dance beneath the earth like prayers offered to something that has no name. And sometimes, on the quietest mornings when the world holds its breath and the only sound is that deep, rhythmic humming that rises from the stones, I think I hear voices calling from somewhere far below. 7 voices, maybe 8, calling in harmony with that underground psalm. They don't sound frightened. They don't sound like they're in pain. They sound like they're welcoming someone home. The ditch is still there, waiting. Still shallow, still lined with those smooth stones that catch the light in ways stones shouldn't. Still humming its patient song to travelers who haven't learned yet that some roads don't lead where you think they're going. And sometimes, on the longest nights of winter when the darkness presses close and the wind carries sounds that might be voices, I find myself thinking about Marcus Webb and his warm coffee and his neatly folded hands. Thinking about the careful way his belongings were arranged, like someone had been preparing him for the most important journey of his life. Thinking about how peaceful he looked, sitting there in that buried cruiser with his shoes off and his duties done, ready at last to discover what lies at the end of the hollow road. I counted 7 missing cars last winter. But winter comes around again, and the count keeps growing. And somewhere in the dark between the trees, something old and patient continues its collection, one careful arrangement at a time. You don't see it. You feel it breathing down your neck. That's what Martha Henley told me the morning she came stumbling into my office. Her face the color of old parchment, and her hands shaking like autumn leaves. Been sheriff of Millbrook for 37 years now, and I've heard every kind of story you can imagine. Drunks seeing pink elephants, teenagers swearing they saw Bigfoot behind the Dairy Queen, old widows convinced their dead husbands were rearranging the furniture at night. You learn to listen with one ear and file the reports with the other hand, nodding at all the right places. But Martha wasn't a drunk or a teenager or a lonely widow. Martha Henley ran the town's only insurance office with the precision of a Swiss watch and had never, in all my years knowing her, uttered so much as a white lie about the weather. When Martha Henley said something, you could bank on it being true as sunrise. She sat across from my desk that Tuesday morning in September, clutching her purse like it might fly away, and told me about the accident she'd witnessed on Route 29, just past Miller's Creek Bridge. Nothing unusual about that. Route 29 claimed at least 2 cars a month, usually city folks taking the curves too fast or locals who'd spent too much time at Paulson's Tavern. What made Martha's story different was what she said she felt standing there in the aftermath. It was like something was watching, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not watching with eyes, mind you. Watching with hunger. I poured her a cup of coffee from the pot that had been brewing since dawn, and let her tell it in her own time. The accident itself was straightforward enough. A sedan from out of state had taken the curve by the old Millbrook Cemetery too fast and wrapped itself around the massive oak that had been standing sentinel there for God knows how many years. Driver was alive but banged up pretty good. Martha had been first on scene, called it in on her cell phone while she checked on the victim. I walked up to the car, she said, staring into her coffee cup like it held answers. Young man inside was conscious, bleeding from his forehead but talking. I was asking him his name, you know, keeping him awake like they tell you to do, when I felt it. She paused, took a sip of coffee with trembling hands. Felt what, Martha? The breathing. Like something big was standing right behind me, close enough that I should have felt its chest moving, should have smelled its breath. But when I turned around, she shook her head. Nothing there. Just the road and the trees and that feeling like ice water in my veins. I wrote it down because that's what you do, but I figured the poor woman had just been shaken by seeing the accident. Blood and twisted metal can do things to your mind, make you imagine all sorts of nonsense. I patted her shoulder, told her she'd done good helping that young man, and filed her statement away with all the others. That was Tuesday. By Friday, I had 3 more reports sitting on my desk, each one stranger than the last. Eddie Kowalski came in Thursday evening, still wearing his tow truck coveralls and smelling like motor oil and cigarettes. Eddie had been pulling wrecked cars off Route 29 for 15 years and had seen enough twisted metal to build a small city. Nothing much bothered Eddie anymore, nothing except what happened when he went to collect the sedan from Tuesday's accident. "Sheriff, I've pulled hundreds of cars out of that ditch," he said, settling his bulk into the chair across from my desk. "But I never felt anything like this before." Eddie had arrived at the scene around sunset, when the shadows were long and the air carried that particular chill that September brings to our part of the world. The sedan was still wrapped around the oak, waiting for him like a broken tooth. Standard recovery job: hook up the winch, drag the car back onto the road, load it onto the flatbed. Should have taken 20 minutes, 30 at the outside. "I got the chains hooked up, no problem," Eddie said. Started the winch, and that's when it happened. The car started coming free, metal scraping against bark, and I heard, "Christ, Sheriff, I don't know how to describe it." I waited while he fumbled for his words. Like something whimpering. Not the car, cars don't whimper. This was softer. Sadder. Like whatever was doing it was in pain, real deep pain. He paused, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Then I felt the breathing. There was that word again. Breathing. Same as Martha described? Worse. Like whatever it was right there beside me, close enough to touch. But there wasn't nothing there, Sheriff. Nothing at all. Eddie had finished the job as quickly as possible, loaded the sedan, and driven back to his yard with his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel and his eyes checking the mirrors every few seconds. He'd been towing cars for 15 years, he told me again, and nothing had ever spooked him like that. The third report came from Sarah Chin, who taught 2nd grade at Millbrook Elementary, and had been driving home from her night class at the community college over in Ashford. Sarah was young, maybe 25, with the kind of practical no-nonsense attitude you needed to handle a classroom full of 7-year-olds. Like Martha, she wasn't given to flights of fancy. Sarah had come upon an accident scene on Route 29, different spot but same road, around 10:30 Thursday night. This one was a pickup truck that had somehow left the pavement and rolled down the embankment behind Paulson's Tavern. The driver was unconscious but breathing, and Sarah had done the right thing, called 911, climbed down to check on him, waited for the ambulance. I was kneeling beside the truck. She told me Friday morning, her voice steady but her eyes haunted. The driver was coming around, mumbling something about a shadow in the road. I figured he was just confused from the accident, you know? Head injuries can do that. She'd been asking him questions, trying to keep him alert, while they waited for the paramedics, when she became aware of a presence behind her. Not a sound, not a movement, just the unmistakable feeling that something was there. I kept expecting to turn around and see another person, she said. Maybe someone else who'd stop to help. But every time I looked, there was nothing. Just darkness and trees and this sense that something was watching us. The breathing started when the ambulance arrived, she said. As the paramedics worked to stabilize the driver and load him onto a stretcher, Sarah stood at the edge of the embankment and felt warm breath on the back of her neck. Rhythmic, patient breathing, like something waiting for the right moment. The strangest part, she said, was when they were loading the driver into the ambulance. Just for a second, as the doors were closing, I thought I saw something move in the back with him. Like a shadow that didn't belong to any of the paramedics. 3 reports in 4 days. 3 different people, 3 different accidents, all on Route 29. All involving the same impossible presence, the same sense of being watched by something that existed in the spaces between what you could see and what you could prove. I should have dismissed it. Should have written it off as coincidence, suggestion, the kind of mass hysteria that small towns are famous for. But I'd been sheriff of Millbrook long enough to know the difference between nonsense and something that deserved attention. And this felt like something that deserved attention. I started driving Route 29 myself, morning and evening patrols, keeping my eyes open for anything unusual. The road stretched for 12 miles through our township, winding through forest and farmland like a black ribbon stitched to the earth. It passed the old Millbrook Cemetery, where stones dating back to the 1800s leaned at crazy angles among the overgrown grass. It curved around Miller's Creek, where the water ran dark and slow beneath the covered bridge. It skirted the edge of Paulson's property, where 3 generations of the same family had served drinks to locals who preferred their socializing done in shadows. Nothing unusual during the day. Just another country road, carrying its usual traffic of farmers and commuters and the occasional tourist who'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. But in the early evening, when the sun was low and the shadows were long, Route 29 felt different. Expectant. Like it was waiting for something. I didn't have to wait long to find out what. The call came in at 6:47 p.m. on Sunday, just as I was finishing up the paperwork from a domestic disturbance over on Elm Street. Single car accident on Route 29, about a mile past the cemetery. Driver appeared to be injured but conscious. I grabbed my keys and headed out, taking the cruiser instead of my personal truck because something told me this was going to be official business. The accident was worse than the others. A compact car had left the road at high speed and crashed through the wooden fence that bordered the Hendricks pasture. The car had rolled at least twice before coming to rest against a line of maple trees, and I could see even from the road that the driver was in bad shape. But that wasn't what made me stop the cruiser 50 yards from the accident scene and sit there with my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. It was the silence. Not the normal silence you might expect at an accident scene, but something deeper. Something that seemed to press against your eardrums like water. The kind of silence that made you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the small sounds your body made just by existing. I forced myself to get out of the cruiser and walk toward the wreckage. The compact car was a Honda, maybe 5 years old, with Maryland plates. The driver's side was completely caved in, and I could see someone moving weakly inside. A woman, young, with blood matting her blonde hair. I called for an ambulance on my radio, then approached the car. The woman was conscious but dazed, mumbling something I couldn't quite make out. I tried the driver's door but it was jammed shut, so I went around to the passenger side and managed to get it open. "Ma'am? Can you hear me? I'm Sheriff Morrison. Help's on the way." She turned her head toward me, and I saw that her eyes were wide with something beyond pain, beyond fear. Something closer to recognition. "It followed me," she whispered. "What followed you?" "The shadow. It was in the road, Sheriff. Standing right in the middle of the road." I'd heard that before. The driver Saracen had helped, the one who'd rolled his pickup behind Paulson's, had mumbled about a shadow in the road. At the time I'd figured it was just confusion from the head injury. "What did this shadow look like?" I asked, keeping my voice calm while I checked her for obvious injuries. Like nothing. But not nothing, you know? Like the shape that nothing makes when it's trying to be something." That's when I felt it. The breathing. It started as a whisper of air against the back of my neck, so faint I might have dismissed it as wind if there had been any wind that evening. But the air was perfectly still, the kind of stillness that comes just before a storm. The breathing was warm and steady and completely impossible. I turned around slowly, my hand instinctively moving to my service weapon, though I couldn't have said what I expected to shoot. The pasture behind me was empty except for a few scattered Holstein cows who seemed unusually restless, shifting and lowing softly in the gathering dusk. The breathing continued. Patient, rhythmic, like something taking its time. "Do you feel it?" the woman whispered from inside the car. I didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because as I stood there in the fading light, I began to see what she'd been talking about. Not see exactly. More like the way you notice the shape of darkness between trees, or the space where a shadow should fall but doesn't. There was something standing at the edge of the wreckage. Something that existed in the place where your eyes wanted to focus but couldn't quite manage. It was tall, taller than a person, and seemed to shift and flow like smoke, but smoke with intention, with purpose. The ambulance arrived before I could decide whether I was losing my mind or witnessing something that would change everything I thought I knew about the world. The paramedics took over, extracting the woman from the wreckage with professional efficiency while I stood aside and tried to process what I'd experienced. The presence, whatever it was, faded as more people arrived. The breathing stopped. The impossible shadow at the edge of perception melted back into the ordinary darkness between the trees. By the time the tow truck arrived to collect the Honda, Route 29 felt like just another road again. But I knew better now. I knew something was haunting that stretch of asphalt, something that fed on accidents and trauma and pain. Something that watched from the spaces between seeing and knowing. I started researching the history of Route 29 that week, digging through old newspaper archives and county records. What I found made my blood run cold. The road had been built in 1923, following the path of an older route that dated back to the 1800s. Before that, it had been a Native American trail, used by the local tribes to reach the sacred burial ground that was now the Millbrook Cemetery. The trail had been abandoned sometime in the 1850s, after a series of mysterious deaths along its length. According to the records, travelers on the old trail had reported encounters with what they described as a shadow walker, a formless presence that appeared near sites of suffering and death. The local tribes had considered it a guardian of sorts, a spirit that guided the dying from this world to the next. But the white settlers who came later told different stories, darker stories, about something that didn't guide so much as feed. The accidents on Route 29 went back to the very beginning. Even in 1923, the year the road opened, there had been reports of vehicles leaving the pavement for no apparent reason, drivers claiming they'd swerved to avoid something that wasn't there. Over the decades, the reports had been consistent. A shadow in the road, a presence at accident scenes, the feeling of being watched by something hungry and patient. I counted the official accident reports going back 50 years. Route 29 had claimed 127 vehicles in that time, resulting in 43 deaths and over 200 injuries. For a rural road that saw maybe 100 cars a day, the statistics were staggering. But it wasn't the numbers that kept me awake at night. It was the pattern. Every accident, without exception, had occurred during the transition times, dawn or dusk, those liminal hours when the world exists between light and darkness. Every driver who survived reported seeing a shadow in the road just before the crash. And every accident scene, according to the witnesses, had been marked by the same impossible presence, the same sense of being watched by something that existed in the gaps between what was real and what was possible. I should have reported it to the state police, should have asked for help from someone with more resources and less personal investment. But I'd been sheriff of Millbrook for 37 years, and Route 29 was my responsibility. If something was hunting on my stretch of road, it was my job to stop it. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. The call came in at 7:23 p.m. on a Thursday in October. Single car accident on Route 29, just past the covered bridge over Miller's Creek. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my service weapon, a flashlight, and a digital camera I'd borrowed from my nephew, and headed out into the gathering darkness. I found the car wrapped around the same oak tree where Martha Henley had witnessed the first accident 6 weeks earlier. A newer model sedan, blue, with 2 occupants, a man and woman in their 30s, both conscious but shaken. The man had a gash on his forehead. The woman was holding her left arm against her chest, probably a broken wrist. But they were alive, and they were talking, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I had witnesses who could tell me exactly what had happened. There was something in the road, the man said as I helped him out of the passenger seat. Standing right in the middle of the road. What did it look like? I asked, training my flashlight into the darkness beyond the headlights. Like... He paused, searching for words. Like a person-shaped hole cut out of the world. The woman nodded agreement. We saw it maybe 50 yards ahead. My husband slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. We were going too fast for the curve. Where is it now? They looked at each other, then back at me. Still there, the woman whispered. It's still there. I turned my flashlight toward the road and felt my breath catch in my throat. There, perhaps 30 yards from the accident scene, stood something that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on it. It was tall and roughly humanoid, but wrong in ways that made my brain hurt. Like looking at a photograph negative of a person, but darker, deeper, as if light itself was being pulled into it and consumed. The breathing started again, that warm, patient exhalation against the back of my neck. But this time I was ready for it. This time I had questions. What do you want? I called out to the shadow. It didn't answer, but it moved. Not walked. Movement implied a body, limbs, the mechanical action of muscles and joints. This thing flowed like smoke, drifting closer with a motion that reminded me of seaweed swaying in an underwater current. The camera felt heavy in my hands as I raised it and triggered the flash. The brief illumination showed me nothing but empty road, but when the darkness returned, the shadow was closer. Much closer. I could feel its attention now, focused on me with the intensity of a searchlight. The breathing grew stronger, more pronounced, and with it came a scent that made my stomach clench, the smell of old copper and wet earth, like coins buried in a grave. Sheriff? The woman's voice was tight with fear. Sheriff, it's moving toward us. I could see that. The shadow was flowing across the asphalt like spilled ink, moving with deliberate purpose toward the accident scene, toward the injured couple, toward the fresh trauma and pain it had been waiting for. That's when I understood. The accidents weren't random. They were orchestrated. This thing, this shadow walker, this hunger-given form, was causing the crashes, positioning itself in the road at just the right moment to send cars spinning off into trees and ditches and embankments. It was farming us, cultivating suffering like a crop to be harvested when the time was right. And I was the only thing standing between it and 2 more victims. I drew my service weapon, knowing it was useless but needing the weight of it in my hand. Stay back, I called to the shadow, though I didn't expect it to listen. It paused at the sound of my voice, and for a moment the breathing stopped. Then it began again, but different now. Faster. Excited. Like a predator that had just noticed the scent of blood. The shadow flowed closer, and as it approached I began to understand why none of the drivers had been able to avoid it. It wasn't just standing in the road. It was the road, somehow. It existed in the space between the yellow lines, in the texture of the asphalt itself, in the very idea of a path from one place to another. When you drove down Route 29 in the transition hours, when the light was failing and your mind was tired, the shadow became part of your perception of the road ahead. You didn't swerve to avoid it. You swerved because it made you see curves that weren't there, obstacles that existed only in the moment between seeing and believing. It was 10 feet away now, and I could feel the temperature dropping around me like a stone thrown into deep water. The injured couple behind me were whimpering, making small frightened sounds that seemed to please the shadow. Its breathing quickened, became hungrier. That's when I realized something that should have occurred to me weeks ago. The accidents weren't random in another way. They all happened at specific locations along Route 29. The oak tree by the cemetery. The embankment behind Paulson's. The curve at Miller's Creek Bridge. Places where the road intersected with the old trail, the path the Native Americans had used to reach their burial ground. Sacred places. Thin places. Places where the boundary between worlds was gossamer fine and easily crossed. I backed toward the cruiser, keeping the shadow in sight while I fumbled for my radio. If I was right about the locations, if the shadow was bound to the old trail, then maybe. The radio crackled to life in my hand. Sheriff? This is dispatch. We've got another accident reported on Route 29, mile marker 7. Single vehicle, possible fatality. Mile marker 7. That would be the bend near the old Jameson farm, where the trail crossed the road on its way to the sacred grove that had been cut down to make room for a shopping center. The shadow stopped moving. For a moment it hung in the air like smoke frozen in amber, and I swear I could feel its attention splitting, torn between the fresh trauma at mile marker 7 and the unfinished business here at the oak tree. Then it was gone. Not faded, gone, like a light switch being flipped off. The temperature returned to normal, the impossible breathing stopped, and Route 29 became just another dark road in the middle of nowhere. I helped the injured couple into my cruiser and drove them to the hospital myself, partly because the ambulance was busy at mile marker 7 and partly because I needed time to think about what I'd witnessed. On the drive, they told me more about their encounter, how they'd been driving home from dinner in Ashford when they noticed a shape in their headlights, something that seemed to be walking along the center line of the road. How they'd followed it for almost a mile before it stopped and turned toward them, revealing the absence where its face should have been. It wasn't trying to scare us, the woman said as we pulled into the hospital parking lot. It was hurting us. Like a sheepdog moving sheep toward a pen. She was right. The shadow had been guiding them toward the oak tree, toward the intersection of road and trail where the boundary was thinnest and the harvest would be richest. I spent the rest of that night driving Route 29, checking every accident site, every place where the old trail crossed the modern road. At each location I found the same thing, a lingering coldness, a sense of patient waiting, and the faint scent of copper and earth that marked the shadow's presence. By dawn I had mapped the entire route of the old trail, tracing its path through the township like a thread of darkness stitched into the landscape. 12 intersection points, 12 places where the shadow could manifest and hunt. 12 locations where the barrier between worlds was thin enough for something ancient and hungry to reach through. I should have closed the road. Should have barricaded every intersection, posted warnings, done something to protect the people who traveled Route 29 in the dangerous hours. But who would have believed me? How do you explain to a town council that their main thoroughfare is haunted by something that feeds on suffering and death? Instead, I did what I could. I started patrolling Route 29 every evening, timing my rounds to coincide with the shadow's hunting hours. When I encountered it, and I encountered it often, once I knew where to look, I would position my cruiser between the shadow and oncoming traffic, forcing drivers to slow down, to notice the obstacle in the road that existed somewhere between real and imagined. It worked, mostly. The accidents decreased, though they didn't stop entirely. The shadow was patient, clever, willing to wait for the perfect moment when my patrol route took me elsewhere or fatigue made me careless. But I saved lives. I know I saved lives. The price was my sanity, or at least my ability to sleep through the night without dreams of flowing darkness and the scent of buried copper. The price was the knowledge that something hungry and ancient was sharing my town, my road, my responsibility. The price was understanding that some hungers are older than civilization, older than law, older than the thin barriers we build between ourselves and the darkness that waits patiently for its chance to feed. I retired 6 months later, turned my badge over to a younger man who looked at me with concern and asked if I was feeling all right. I told him I was fine, just tired, ready to spend my time fishing instead of chasing shadows. I didn't tell him about Route 29. Didn't warn him about the intersection points, or the dangerous hours, or the breathing that comes from nowhere and everywhere at once. Maybe that makes me a coward. Maybe I should have tried harder to make him understand. But I'd spent 6 months looking into the space between real and impossible, and I knew that some knowledge is too heavy for one person to carry alone. The new sheriff is a good man, thorough and dedicated. He patrols Route 29 regularly, responds quickly to accident calls, files his reports with precision and care. He doesn't know that something watches him from the spaces between seeing and believing, something that waits patiently for the moment when his attention wanders or his courage fails. The accidents continue. Not as many as before, but enough. Enough to feed whatever it is that haunts the intersection of the old trail and the new road. Enough to keep the shadow strong and patient and hungry. I still drive Route 29 sometimes, usually in broad daylight when the shadow sleeps and the road is just a road. But sometimes, when the light is fading and the air is still, I feel something breathing down my neck and remember that there are hungers in this world that badges and guns cannot touch. You don't see it. You feel it breathing down your neck. And once you feel it, you never stop feeling it, not really. It becomes part of you, that knowledge of the patient darkness that waits in the spaces between what is and what might be. It becomes part of your understanding of the world, the recognition that civilization is just a thin layer of light spread over something much older and hungrier and more patient than we can imagine. The shadow is still there, still hunting, still feeding on the intersection of trauma and fear and the thin places where worlds touch. It will always be there, because some hungers are eternal and some darkness is older than the light we use to hold it back. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is still and the moon is dark, I drive out to Route 29 and park at one of the intersection points, just to listen. Just to remember what it feels like to stand at the edge of something vast and patient and hungry. You don't see it. You feel it breathing down your neck. And that breathing never really stops. I shattered the glass. The face didn't move. That was 37 years ago. And I still wake up some nights with the sound of that breaking window echoing in my ears. Not the crash itself, that was simple enough, predictable as gravity. No, it's the silence that followed. The absolute, impossible silence of a face that should have flinched, should have turned away, should have done something human when a rock the size of a man's fist exploded the glass inches from its nose. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what happens when you carry a story this long. The end keeps trying to swallow the beginning. My name doesn't matter much anymore. What matters is that I wore a badge in Millbrook for 43 years. And in all that time, I learned that some things in this world don't follow the rules we pretend govern everything else. Millbrook sits in a valley between two ridges of pine and scrub oak, the kind of place that maps forget to update, and highways seemed to bend around. Population never quite reached 1,000, even when the lumber mill was running. Now it hovers somewhere around 600, give or take whoever's decided to leave that particular week. The Crane building started it all. 4 stories of red brick and limestone, built in 1887 by a man named Josiah Crane, who made his fortune in railroad ties and lost it in bad investments. The building housed his offices, a small bank, and a haberdashery until the money ran out and Crane put a bullet through his temple in what would later become Apartment 3B. That was 1902. The building changed hands a few times after that, served as a boarding house, then apartments, then offices again. By the time I became sheriff in 1965, it had been empty for nearly a decade. The windows were the first thing you noticed about the Crane building. Tall, narrow things with heavy sashes, they ran in rows across each floor like watching eyes. Most of them were boarded up or covered with newspaper and cardboard, but there was one, 3rd floor, second window from the left, that stayed clear. Clean, even. While the rest of the building collected dust and decay, that window remained pristine, as if someone washed it every morning with care. I noticed it during my first week on the job, making my rounds through downtown. Something about it caught my eye, made me slow the patrol car and take a longer look. The building had been empty since 1954, according to the county records, but that window looked lived in. Looked watched from. "You see it too, don't you?" The voice belonged to Earl Hutchins, who ran the hardware store across the street. He'd walked up to my car while I was staring at the building, and now he stood with his hands in his pockets, looking up at that same window. "See what?" "The face." I looked again. Nothing but glass and darkness beyond. "Don't see anything, Earl." He nodded, but kept looking up. "Give it time. Seems like it takes a while for new people to notice. Old Sheriff Kowalski, he pretended not to see it for years. But I watched him. He'd drive by here twice a day, sometimes 3 times, always slowing down to look up at that window. You're telling me there's someone in there?" "Someone. Something. Been there as long as I can remember, and I've been here since 1943. Earl finally looked at me instead of the window. "You'll see it soon enough. They always do." I drove away thinking Earl Hutchins had been sniffing too much paint thinner, but something made me come back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the week, I was making that route past the Crane building twice every shift, telling myself I was just being thorough. The building sat on the corner of Main and Elm, kitty corner from Earl's hardware store and directly across from the Millbrook Diner. From the street, you could see that most of the windows were either boarded up or so dirty they might as well have been painted black. But that one window on the 3rd floor stayed clear, and after a while, I started to understand what Earl meant. There was something in the glass. Not a reflection. I knew what reflections looked like, and this wasn't one. It was more like a shadow with weight to it, a darkness that seemed to have substance. The first time I really saw it, I was sitting in the diner having coffee with Martha Pennington, who'd been running the place since before I was born. "You keep looking at that building," she said, not looking up from the crossword puzzle she was working on. "Join the club. Earl mentioned something about a face in the window. Earl talks too much." She set down her pencil and finally looked at me. "But he's not wrong. You've seen it? Honey, I've been watching that window for 20 years. Started when my late husband pointed it out to me. He swore he could see a man standing there, looking down at the street. Thought he was crazy until I saw it myself." "What did you see?" She was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee even though she'd already stirred it 3 times. "A face. Just a face looking out. Always the same position, always the same expression. If you can call it an expression." What do you mean? Come back tomorrow around 3 in the afternoon. Sit right here in this booth. Look up at that window for 10 minutes without looking away. Then tell me what you think. I did exactly that. Sat in that red vinyl booth at 3 o'clock sharp, ordered coffee I didn't want, and stared up at that third-floor window. For the first 5 minutes, I saw nothing but glass and darkness. Then, slowly, like an old photograph developing in a darkroom, I began to make out something in the shadows behind the glass. A face. Pale, indistinct, but unmistakably human. Male, from what I could tell, with dark hair and what might have been a beard. He was standing close to the window, close enough that his breath should have fogged the glass. But the glass remained clear. The face was perfectly still. Not the stillness of someone trying not to move, but the absolute stillness of stone. No blink, no shift of weight, no small movements that living people make without thinking. Just a face, looking down at the street with what I can only describe as patient attention. I watched for the full 10 minutes Martha had suggested, and in all that time, the face never moved. Not once. When I finally looked away, my eyes were watering and my coffee had gone cold. Well? Martha asked. I saw something. What did it look like? I described what I'd seen, and Martha nodded slowly. That's him. That's what we all see. Same face, same position, same stillness. Has anyone ever gone inside to check? Building's been locked up tight since 1954. Owner lives in Chicago, doesn't care what happens to it as long as the taxes get paid. Few people have tried to get in over the years. None of them found anything. You mean they found the building empty? I mean they found the building empty and never talked about what they saw in there. Funny how that works. I left the diner that day with more questions than answers, but also with a growing certainty that something was genuinely wrong with the Crane building. Not wrong in the way a building gets wrong when it's abandoned, pipes freeze, roof leaks, foundation settles. Wrong in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up when I drove past it. Over the next few weeks, I made it my business to learn everything I could about the building. Property records, tax assessments, fire department reports, anything that might give me a clue about what I was dealing with. What I found was a pattern of ownership that read like a genealogy of misfortune. After Josiah Crane's suicide in 1902, the building was sold to a company that used it as a boarding house. 3 different tenants fell down the stairs and died between 1905 and 1908. The building was then converted to apartments, but keeping tenants proved difficult. People moved in and moved out quickly, often leaving behind personal belongings and owing rent. In 1923, the building was sold again, this time to a man who planned to convert it to office space. He succeeded, but the businesses that rented space there rarely lasted more than a year or 2. Insurance companies, law offices, even a doctor's practice, they all moved in with high hopes and moved out citing unforeseen circumstances. The last business to occupy the building was a dentist's office on the 2nd floor. Dr. Harrison Kempler had been practicing there for nearly 2 years when he simply disappeared in March of 1954. His appointment book showed patients scheduled for the rest of the week, but he never showed up to see them. His car was found in the parking lot behind the building, keys still in the ignition. He was never seen again. After that, the building sat empty. The owner, a holding company based in Chicago, made a few half-hearted attempts to find new tenants, but eventually gave up and let the building slide into disrepair. The city condemned it twice, but the owner paid the necessary fines and made the minimum repairs required to keep it from being demolished. All of this information was interesting, but it didn't explain the face in the window. If anything, it made the mystery deeper. If the building had been empty since 1954, Who or what was I seeing on the third floor? I decided to find out. Getting into the building proved easier than I'd expected. The main entrance was chained shut, but there was a service door in the alley that had been painted over so many times the lock was mostly decorative. A little pressure with a screwdriver, and I was inside. The smell hit me first. Not the musty, stale air you'd expect from a building that had been closed up for over a decade, but something else. Something organic and unpleasant, like meat that had been left out too long. I pulled out my flashlight and started up the stairs. The first floor had been offices. Desks and filing cabinets sat under dusty sheets, and the walls were lined with empty bookcases. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust that showed no signs of disturbance. No footprints, no handprints, no indication that anyone had been in the building for years. The second floor was the same. The dentist's office was still there, dental chairs and equipment covered in sheets, waiting for a doctor who would never return. The dust was thicker here, and the smell was stronger. I found myself breathing through my mouth as I climbed to the third floor. The third floor was different. The dust was thinner here, as if someone had been walking around recently. Not completely clean, but disturbed. Scuffed. And the smell was strongest here, concentrated and almost overwhelming. I followed it down the hallway, past empty offices and storage rooms, until I reached the room that would have been directly behind the window I'd been watching. The door was closed. I put my hand on the knob and found it was warm. I opened the door. The room was empty. Completely, utterly empty. No furniture, no debris, no signs that anyone had ever been there. But the smell was overpowering now, and I realized it wasn't coming from the room itself. It was coming from the window. I walked to the window and looked out. From this angle, I could see the diner across the street, the hardware store, the entire downtown area of Millbrook spread out below. This was the view the face had been looking at. This was where it stood. But there was no one here. No one and nothing. I turned to leave and noticed something I'd missed before. The floor directly in front of the window was worn. Not damaged, not dirty, but worn smooth, as if someone had been standing in that exact spot for years. Decades. The wood was polished to a dull sheen by constant use. I knelt and put my hand on the worn spot. The wood was warm, like the doorknob had been. Warm and slightly soft, as if it had been compressed by weight over time. I stood up quickly and got out of that room, out of that building, as fast as I could manage. But as I locked the service door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked up at the third-floor window, and even though I'd just been in that room and knew it was empty, I could swear I saw something in the glass. Something that looked like a face. That night, I called the Chicago number for the building's owner. After being transferred 3 times, I finally reached a man named Patterson who claimed to be the property manager. "Sheriff, I've been waiting for your call," he said, which surprised me. "You have?" "Oh, yes. We get a call from someone in Millbrook every few years. Always about the same thing. The window." "Then you know about it?" "I know what people claim to see. I also know that building has been empty since 1954, and we've had it inspected multiple times. There's no one in there. Have you ever seen it yourself?" Patterson was quiet for a moment. "I drove down there once, about 10 years ago. Had to see what all the fuss was about. And I saw what everyone else sees. A face in the window. But here's the thing, Sheriff, I also had a key to that building. I went inside and checked every room, every closet, every corner. Nothing. Not so much as a mouse. But you saw the face?" "I saw something. What it was, I couldn't tell you. But it wasn't human. Couldn't be. What makes you so sure? Because I watched it for 3 hours, Sheriff. 3 hours straight. And in all that time, it never moved. Not once. No person can stand that still for that long. No living person. I thanked Patterson and hung up, but his words stayed with me. No living person. The implication was clear, but I wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet. Over the next few months, I made watching the window part of my routine. I'd sit in the diner during slow afternoons, drinking coffee and observing. I'd park across the street during evening patrols, engine running, just watching. I started keeping a notebook, recording the times I saw the face and the times I didn't. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. The face appeared most often during daylight hours, particularly in the afternoon. It was always in the same position, always perfectly still. But there were variations that I began to notice. Sometimes it seemed closer to the window, sometimes farther back. Sometimes it appeared to be looking down at the street, sometimes directly ahead. And sometimes, though I might have been imagining this, it seemed to be looking directly at me. I also began to notice other things. The window never accumulated dust or water spots, despite being on the 3rd floor of an abandoned building. Birds never perched on the windowsill, though they used every other available surface on the building. And on days when the face was particularly clear, particularly defined, people walking past the building would unconsciously cross to the other side of the street. It was Earl Hutchins who first suggested I talk to Mrs. Kowalski. "She's the one who really knows," he said. "Her husband dealt with this for 20 years before you came along." Mrs. Kowalski lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by garden plots and chicken coops. She was in her 70s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed older than her face. When I explained why I was there, she nodded as if she'd been expecting me. "Frank knew this day would come," she said, settling into a rocking chair on her front porch. "He always said the building would outlast him, and whoever came after would have to deal with it. What did he know about it? More than he ever told anyone. Frank was a practical man, but he wasn't a fool. He knew there were things in this world that don't fit into neat categories." She was quiet for a moment, rocking slowly, looking out at the hills beyond her garden. "The face started appearing in 1943, she said finally. "Right after the Hendricks boy went missing." "What Hendricks boy?" "Tommy Hendricks. 17 years old, worked at the mill after school. He disappeared one evening in November. Just gone. No trace, no explanation. Frank was a deputy then, and he spent weeks looking for that boy. Never found so much as a footprint. What does that have to do with the building? Tommy was the last person seen entering the Crane building. There was still a business on the 1st floor then, an insurance office. Tommy had a part-time job cleaning the place in the evenings. He went in one night and never came out. They searched the building, top to bottom, 3 times. Found nothing. But a week later, people started seeing the face in the window. Same window, same position, same stillness. Frank always believed it was Tommy. You're saying Tommy Hendricks has been standing in that window for over 20 years. Mrs. Kowalski stopped rocking and looked at me directly. I'm saying something has been standing in that window for over 20 years, and it started right after Tommy disappeared. You draw your own conclusions. I left Mrs. Kowalski's house with a new sense of urgency. If there was even a chance that Tommy Hendricks was somehow trapped in that building, I had to find him. The fact that he would have been dead for decades didn't matter. In my line of work, you learn to follow the evidence, even when it leads to places you'd rather not go. I went back to the building that evening, just as the sun was setting. The face was there, clearer than I'd ever seen it before. And for the first time, I thought I could make out features. The dark hair Mrs. Kowalski had mentioned, the young face of a 17-year-old boy. I called out to it, stood in the middle of the street, and shouted up at the window, "Tommy! Tommy Hendricks!" The face didn't move, didn't react. But something changed in the air around me. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could feel something watching me. Not just from the window, but from everywhere. The building itself seemed to lean forward, as if it were listening. I shouted again, "If you can hear me, give me a sign!" The streetlight above me flickered and went out. The one next to it did the same. Then the next one, and the next, until every streetlight on the block was dark except for one directly across from the building. That one began to glow brighter, then brighter still, until it was blazing like a small sun. Then it exploded. Glass rained down on the street, and I dove for cover behind a parked car. When the shower of glass stopped, I looked up at the window. The face was still there, but something was different. It was closer to the glass now, close enough that I could see details I had never noticed before. It wasn't just the face of a young man. It was the face of a young man in distress. The mouth was open, as if he were shouting or screaming, but no sound came out. The eyes were wide with what looked like terror or desperation. And there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. The face was pressed against the glass from the inside. Nose flattened, cheeks compressed, like someone trying to push through a barrier that wouldn't give way. I ran home and called the fire department. I told them there was someone trapped in the crane building, possibly injured, and they needed to get there immediately. Within 20 minutes, 3 fire trucks and an ambulance were parked outside the building. The firefighters broke down the front door and searched every room, every floor, every corner. They found nothing. But when they came out, the fire chief walked over to me with a strange expression on his face. "We didn't find anyone," he said. "But we found something else." "What?" "The room behind that third-floor window. The one everyone's always talking about. The floor in there is, well, it's soft. Like it's been compressed. And it's warm. Not just warm, hot. Like someone's been standing there for hours. But no one was there?" "No one was there. But Sheriff, I've been fighting fires for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like this. That room feels occupied. It feels inhabited." That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and thought about what Mrs. Kowalski had told me. Tommy Hendricks had entered the building in 1943 and never come out. The face had appeared in the window a week later and had been there ever since. And now, 23 years later, the fire chief was telling me the room felt inhabited. There was only one explanation that made sense, and it was an explanation I didn't want to accept. But sometimes, in this job, you have to accept things that don't make sense. You have to trust what you see, even when what you see is impossible. Tommy Hendricks was in that room. Not alive, not dead, but somehow present. Somehow trapped between whatever had happened to him in 1943 and whatever was keeping him in that window. And if he was trapped, then maybe there was a way to free him. I went back to the building the next morning, but this time I didn't go inside. Instead, I stood across the street and looked up at the window. The face was there, just as it had been for over 2 decades. But now I knew who I was looking at. "Tommy," I said, not shouting this time but speaking in a normal voice. "I know you're in there. I know you've been in there for 23 years. I don't know what happened to you, but I'm going to help you." The face didn't move, but I felt something change. A shift in the air, a sense of attention focusing on me. "I'm going to find a way to get you out of there," I continued. "But I need you to help me. I need you to show me what happened." Nothing happened for several minutes. Then, slowly, the face began to move. Not much, just a slight turn of the head, a shift of the eyes. It was looking down now, down at the street directly below the window. I looked down at the spot where the face was looking. There was nothing there but sidewalk and street. But as I watched, I began to see something else. A shadow on the pavement, darker than the shadows cast by the buildings around it. A shadow in the shape of a person lying down. I knelt and put my hand on the shadow. The concrete was cold, colder than it should have been on a warm morning. And beneath my hand, I could feel something that shouldn't have been there. A depression in the sidewalk, as if something heavy had been lying there for a very long time. When I looked up at the window again, the face was gone. I spent the rest of that day in the county courthouse, going through old records and newspaper files. What I found confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Tommy Hendricks hadn't just disappeared from the Crane building. He'd fallen from the third-floor window. The newspaper account was brief but clear. On November 15, 1943, Tommy Hendricks fell from the third floor of the Crane building and died instantly. The fall was ruled accidental, though there was some question about what he'd been doing near the window in the first place. His job was to clean the insurance office on the first floor, not to go up to the third floor. But here's what the newspaper didn't report, what I found buried in the sheriff's files from 1943. Tommy Hendricks's body was never found. The report stated that he'd fallen from the window and died on impact, but when the police arrived, there was no body on the sidewalk. They searched the area, questioned witnesses, even had the coroner examine the scene. But Tommy Hendricks had simply vanished, leaving behind only a few drops of blood on the pavement, and a depression in the sidewalk that looked like it had been made by a falling body. The official conclusion was that someone had moved the body, though no one could explain who or why. The case was closed as an accidental death, but the file contained a handwritten note from the deputy who'd investigated the scene. "Something is not right about this. The boy fell, but where did he go?" Now I knew. Tommy Hendricks had fallen from that window in 1943, but something had kept him from leaving. Something had trapped him in that room, in that building, in that window, for 23 years. And if I was right, he was still there. I made a decision that probably wasn't wise, but it was the only one I could live with. I was going to go into that building one more time, and I was going to find a way to help Tommy Hendricks. I went that evening, just after sunset. The building was darker than I'd ever seen it, but the face was in the window, clearer and more defined than ever. It was looking down at me as I approached the service door, and I could swear I saw recognition in its eyes. Inside, the smell was overwhelming. Not the organic smell I'd noticed before, but something else. Something that smelled like fear and desperation and time itself. I climbed the stairs slowly, using my flashlight to navigate the darkness. The third floor was different than it had been before. Warmer, more humid, as if the building were breathing. The door to the room behind the window was open, and I could see light coming from inside. Not electric light, but something softer, more natural. Moonlight, maybe, though there was no moon that night. I entered the room and found it exactly as I'd left it. Empty, clean, with the worn spot on the floor in front of the window. But now I could see that the worn spot wasn't just compressed wood. It was something else, something that looked almost organic. Like skin that had been stretched and compressed over decades. I walked to the window and looked out. From this angle, I could see the entire downtown area of Millbrook, just as I had before. But now I could also see something else. A figure on the sidewalk below, lying motionless in the exact spot where I'd felt the depression that morning. I looked more closely and realized the figure was me. Or rather, it was my shadow, cast by the strange light in the room. But the shadow wasn't moving the way shadows should move. It was lying still, arms spread, as if it had fallen from a great height. I understood then what Tommy Hendricks had seen in his last moments. He'd been standing in this room, looking out this window, when something had pushed him. Something that didn't want him to leave, that didn't want him to tell anyone what he'd seen. And now it was my turn. I felt the presence before I saw it. A weight in the air behind me, a sense of something vast and patient and hungry. I turned around and saw nothing but empty room, but I could feel it there. Watching me. Waiting. "I know you're here," I said. "I know what you did to Tommy." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. My breath began to fog, and frost started forming on the window in front of me. "He was just a boy," I continued. "He didn't deserve what you did to him." The presence grew stronger, more oppressive. I could feel it pressing against me, trying to push me toward the window. But I'd come prepared for this. I'd brought something that I hoped would make a difference. I pulled out my service revolver and aimed it at the window. Not at the glass itself, but at the face that was now visible in the reflection. Tommy's face, pressed against the glass from inside the room, mouth open in a silent scream. "You want to keep him here," I said. "You want to keep him trapped forever. But I'm not going to let that happen." I pulled the trigger. The bullet shattered the window completely, sending glass flying in all directions. The sound was deafening in the confined space, but beneath it, I heard something else. A sound like wind, like a sigh, like something being released after decades of captivity. The presence that had been pressing against me vanished instantly. The temperature returned to normal. And in the broken window frame, I saw something that made my heart stop. Tommy Hendricks was standing there. Not a reflection, not a shadow, but the actual boy. 17 years old, exactly as he'd been in 1943. He was looking at me with gratitude and relief, and his mouth was moving, trying to say something. "Thank you," he whispered, though I heard it more in my mind than with my ears. "Thank you for letting me go." He smiled then, the first smile I'd seen from that window in all the months I'd been watching it. And then he was gone. Not fading, not disappearing gradually, but simply not there anymore. I stood in that empty room for a long time, looking out through the broken window at the town below. The streetlights were working again, casting their normal glow on the empty streets. The air smelled clean and fresh, without the oppressive weight that had hung over the building for so long. When I finally left the Crane building that night, I knew I'd never have to go back. The next morning, I drove past the building on my regular patrol. The window was still broken, glass glittering on the sidewalk below. But more importantly, the window was empty. No face, no presence, no sense of being watched. Just an empty window in an abandoned building. Earl Hutchins was standing outside his hardware store, looking up at the broken window. "Heard gunshots last night," he said when I pulled over. "Someone was shooting at bottles behind the building," I told him. "Kids, probably." Earl nodded, but he kept looking up at the window. "Funny thing, though. First time in 23 years I've walked past this building without feeling like someone was watching me. Maybe you're just getting used to it. Maybe." He finally looked at me instead of the window. "Or maybe someone finally helped that boy find his way home." I didn't answer, but Earl seemed to understand. He went back into his store, and I drove away, feeling lighter than I had in months. The Crane building stood empty for another 15 years after that night. The broken window was never repaired, and gradually, the other windows began to break as well. Weather and time did what they do to abandoned buildings, and eventually, the city condemned it and had it torn down. They built a small park where the building used to stand, with benches and a few trees and a playground for children. It's a nice place, peaceful and quiet. But sometimes, when I drive past there, I see a young man sitting on one of the benches. He looks to be about 17 years old, with dark hair and a kind face, and he's always smiling. He waves at me when I drive by, and I wave back. Because I know who he is, and I know he's finally at peace. That's the thing about this job, about being a sheriff in a small town where strange things happen. Sometimes you can't solve a case the way you'd solve it in the big city. Sometimes you have to trust in things that don't make sense, follow evidence that leads to impossible conclusions. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to help someone find their way home. I retired from the sheriff's department 5 years ago, but I still drive past that park every few days. The young man isn't always there, but when he is, he waves. And I know that Tommy Hendricks is finally free, finally at rest, finally where he belongs. The face in the window is gone, but the memory of it remains. And so does the knowledge that some things in this world are bigger than we are, older than we are, and more patient than we could ever be. But sometimes, if we're brave enough and care enough, we can still make a difference. Sometimes we can still help. Sometimes we can still set things right. I shattered the glass, and the face didn't move. But when the glass was gone, so was the face. And in the end, that's what mattered. That's what mattered most of all. It's always the same day, and we never ask who it belongs to. That's what my predecessor told me when I first pinned on this badge 37 years ago, and those words have gnawed at me every October 15th since. Sheriff McCready was a man carved from granite and silence, the kind who could stare down a charging bull or a drunk with a shotgun with equal indifference. But when he spoke those words, his hands shook like autumn leaves. He never explained what he meant. 3 weeks later, his heart gave out while he was sitting on his front porch, morning coffee still steaming in his cup. Some said it was the stress of 30 years keeping peace in a town that didn't want to be kept. Others whispered it was something else entirely. I learned what he meant that first October. The town, I won't tell you its name, but it sits in a valley where the hills fold in on themselves like old flesh, and the sun seems to set an hour earlier than it should, has always been a place where people mind their own business. We've got 3 churches, 2 bars, and 1 school that's been threatening to close for the better part of a decade. Most folks work the lumber mill, or the handful of farms that still turn a profit. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody else's business, but nobody talks about it. Except for the well. The well sits about 2 miles northeast of town, on a patch of land that's changed hands more times than anyone can remember. It's old, older than the settlement itself, older than the native tribes that used to hunt these hills. The stone is smooth and dark, worn by weather and time into something that doesn't quite look like it was made by human hands. Local kids used to dare each other to throw rocks down it, but they stopped doing that sometime in the 50s. Nobody talks about why. I'd been sheriff for 11 months when October 15th came around that first time. The call came in just after sunrise. Mrs. Henley, who lived in the farmhouse closest to the well, her voice high and tight was something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't far from it. "Sheriff, you need to come out here. Something's wrong with the old well." I'd driven past it hundreds of times, never given it much thought. Just another piece of the landscape, like the weathered barn or the oak tree split down the middle by lightning. But as I pulled up the gravel drive to the Henley place, I could smell it before I could see it. Iron. Thick and warm, like the taste you get when you bite your tongue too hard. Mrs. Henley was standing by her kitchen window, curtains pulled tight except for a thin gap she peered through. She was pale as milk, her gray hair uncombed and wild. She'd been up all night, she said. Couldn't sleep. kept hearing sounds. What kind of sounds? Bubbling. Like something cooking. The well was maybe 50 yards from her house, surrounded by a circle of dead grass that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. As I walked toward it, the smell got stronger. By the time I reached the low stone wall that surrounded the opening, I had to breathe through my mouth. The well was full of blood. Not water. Not some red-tinged liquid that might have been contaminated runoff. Blood. Thick, dark, and still warm enough to steam in the cool morning air. It came right up to the rim, so full that it seemed to tremble with the weight of its own surface tension. I stood there for a long time, looking down into that impossible crimson mirror. My reflection stared back, distorted and strange. The smell was overwhelming, not just iron, but something else underneath. Something organic and wrong. I called the state police. They came out with their lab kits and their skeptical expressions. Took samples, ran tests, filed reports. The blood was human, they said. Typo negative. Fresh, but not fresh enough to account for the temperature. They estimated it would take the blood of at least 40 people to fill a well that size. But there were no missing persons. No reports of injuries. No slaughterhouses within 100 miles that processed anything larger than chickens. The blood was gone by the next morning. Not drained, gone. The well was bone dry, not even a stain on the stones. Mrs. Henley swore she'd heard it bubbling all night, but when I came back at dawn, there was nothing but the faint metallic smell lingering in the air. The state police lost interest fast. Small-town weirdness, they called it. Probably some kind of prank, though they couldn't explain how anyone might have pulled it off. They filed their report and forgot about us. But I couldn't forget. I spent that winter asking quiet questions. The older folks in town would get a certain look in their eyes when I brought up the well, like they were remembering something they'd tried very hard to forget. Most wouldn't talk about it at all. A few mumbled about traditions and old agreements. One old-timer, Frank Kowalski, who lived here all his 83 years, pulled me aside at the diner one December morning. "You're new," he said, stirring his coffee with a shaky hand. "So you don't understand how things work here. Help me understand." He was quiet for a long time, watching the steam rise from his cup. "Something's been going on longer than we have. Longer than our grandfathers. The well, it's got an appetite. Been feeding it for more years than anyone can count." "Feeding it what?" But he just shook his head and went back to his coffee. Died that spring, heart attack in his sleep. Peaceful, they said. But I noticed the timing. 3 days before his funeral, someone had left a wreath of white flowers by the well. Fresh flowers, expensive ones. Not the kind you find growing wild around here. The next October 15th, I was ready. I'd parked my cruiser a quarter-mile away and walked through the woods to get a good view of the well before sunrise. Brought a thermos of coffee and a pair of binoculars. Told myself I was going to solve this thing once and for all. I watched the sun come up through the trees, casting long shadows across the dead grass around the well. For hours, nothing happened. Just an empty stone circle and the sound of wind through the branches. Then, around 10 in the morning, I heard the bubbling. It started as a soft sound, like water beginning to boil. Through the binoculars, I could see the first drops welling up from the depths, dark red, catching the sunlight like garnets. Within minutes, the level was rising steadily. That iron smell carried on the wind, making my eyes water. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. It wasn't coming from below. The blood was seeping up through the stones themselves, oozing between the cracks like the well was sweating. The old stone was porous, drinking in the blood from somewhere else and bringing it up to the surface. I watched until the well was full again, that dark mirror reflecting the October sky. Then I did something stupid. I left my hiding spot and walked closer. The blood was warm. I could feel the heat radiating up from the surface, and when I knelt down and dipped my finger in, it was body temperature. Fresh as if it had just left a vein. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Mrs. Henley walking across the dead grass. She was carrying a small bundle wrapped in white cloth, and her face had the serene expression of someone sleepwalking. "Mrs. Henley?" She didn't seem to hear me. She knelt beside the well and unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a white dove, its neck broken, head lolling at an unnatural angle. Without a word, she dropped the bird into the blood. It sank immediately, leaving barely a ripple. Then she stood up and walked back to her house, leaving me alone with the well and a growing certainty that I was in over my head. I started keeping records after that. Not official ones, those would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. But I documented everything: the exact time the blood appeared, how long it stayed, who came to visit the well during those hours. Because people did come. Not every year, but often enough. Always locals, always carrying something small and dead. A cat. A chicken. Once, old Mr. Patterson brought a fish, silver scales flashing in the afternoon light before it disappeared into the red. They never spoke. Never acknowledged my presence, even when I stood right there watching. They'd perform their little ritual and leave, and the next morning the well would be empty again. The third year, I tried to interfere. When Mrs. Coleman came walking across the field with her dead pet rabbit, I stepped out of the trees and tried to talk to her. She looked right through me like I was made of glass. I grabbed her arm, and she was cold, cold as winter ground, despite the warm October day. She dropped the rabbit into the blood anyway. That night I had dreams. Dark dreams about the space beneath the well, about chambers and tunnels that stretched down into the earth like the roots of some massive tree. In the dreams I could hear voices, not words, but intentions. Old intentions, patient and hungry. I woke up with the taste of iron in my mouth and the certain knowledge that the well wasn't just asking for offerings. It was asking for something specific. Something it had been promised long ago. The fourth year, I decided to drain the well. Brought a pump from the volunteer fire department, told them it was a safety concern. The blood was thick as syrup, coating the pump mechanisms and clogging the filters. But we got it all out, every last drop. Didn't matter. By morning, it was full again. The fifth year, I tried to fill it in. Dumped truckload after truckload of dirt and concrete, working through the night. Come dawn, the well was clean and empty, every bit of fill gone. The stone looked like it had been polished. I stopped trying to fight it after that. Instead, I started digging into the town's history. Real history, not the sanitized version they put in the museum. I spent hours in the courthouse basement, going through old land records and mining claims. I drove to the state archive, looking through territorial documents and military reports. The land where the well sits has never been officially owned by anyone. The property records go back to the 1800s, but they all show the same thing: a small circle of land, maybe 50 feet in diameter, marked as reserved, or exempt, or simply blank. Like it wasn't part of the same world as everything around it. I found references to it in old letters and diary entries. The first settlers knew about it. They built their town carefully around it, never too close, never ignoring it completely. There were agreements they wrote. Understandings. Things that had to be maintained. In 1897, a traveling preacher came through town and tried to consecrate the well, declared it unholy ground that needed to be cleansed. They found him 3 days later at the bottom of the well, though the water was only 6 feet deep and he was a strong swimmer. The official cause of death was drowning, but the unofficial story was different. They said his blood had been drained completely, leaving just a pale husk floating on the surface. After that, the town made sure visitors didn't go near the well unsupervised. The pattern held steady for 23 years. Every October 15th, the blood would rise. Every October 16th, it would be gone. The townspeople would bring their small offerings, their dead animals and broken things, and the well would accept them with patient silence. But patterns can break. The 24th year was different. I could feel it in the air weeks before October arrived, a tension, like the moment before lightning strikes. People were nervous. Conversation stopped when I walked into rooms. The phone rang at odd hours, but nobody was on the line when I answered. When the 15th came, I was at my usual observation post in the woods. The blood rose as always, thick and warm and impossible. But this time, nobody came. No offerings. No pale-faced locals sleepwalking across the dead grass. The well waited. As the sun set, I could hear it, a sound like breathing, deep and slow. The surface of the blood began to move, not rippling but pulsing, like a heartbeat made visible. The smell changed too, becoming sharper, hungrier. That night, Tommy Morrison went missing. Tommy was 7 years old, gap-toothed and fearless, the kind of kid who'd try to pet a rattlesnake if you didn't watch him close. His mother found his bedroom empty just after midnight, window open, screen cut from the outside. We searched for 3 days. Brought in dogs, volunteers, state police helicopters. Found nothing. No tracks, no clothing, no sign he'd ever existed. On the 4th day, Mrs. Morrison walked out to the well. I followed her, keeping my distance, watching through the binoculars as she knelt beside the empty stones. She was carrying something in her arms, a wooden toy soldier, painted bright red and blue, one of Tommy's favorites. She dropped it into the dry well, and I heard it hit the bottom with a hollow thunk. Then she walked home, and I never saw her alive again. They found her the next morning, sitting peacefully in her kitchen chair, died in her sleep. Heart failure, the doctor said. Grief, most likely. But I knew better. The toy soldier was gone when I checked the well later. The stones were clean and dry, but there was a new smell in the air, not iron this time, but something else. Something like fresh earth and growing things. The next October, the well demanded more. It wasn't obvious at first. The blood rose as usual, warm and thick and raw. But this time, it didn't disappear overnight. It stayed for 3 days, growing darker and more rank with each passing hour. The smell was unbearable, not just metal and meat, but decay and worse things. On the 3rd night, Sarah Chin didn't come home from her evening walk. She was found the next morning, floating face down in Miller's Pond on the other side of town. Drowned, the coroner said, though she was a champion swimmer in high school and the pond was barely 4 feet deep. What the coroner didn't mention, what I made sure he didn't mention, was that she'd been completely drained of blood. The well was empty again by dawn. After that, October 15th became something different. Not just the day the blood rose, but the day we all held our breath and waited to see what price would be demanded. Sometimes it was satisfied with the old offerings, dead animals and broken toys. Sometimes it wanted more. The Morrison boy was just the beginning. Over the next 13 years, 7 people went missing in October. Always locals, always people who'd lived here their whole lives. The state police would come, ask their questions, file their reports. But they never stayed long enough to understand what they were dealing with. The survivors learned to adapt. October became a month of locked doors and watched children. People would leave town if they could, visit relatives in other states, find excuses to be anywhere but here when the 15th rolled around. But some couldn't leave. Some were too old, too poor, too tied to this place by roots that went deeper than blood. They'd gather in the churches or the diner, waiting it out together, drawing strength from numbers and shared fear. I tried to leave once, back in my 15th year wearing the badge. Took a week's vacation, drove all the way to Florida. But on October 14th, I was in my car heading north, pulled by something stronger than curiosity or duty. I made it back just as the blood was starting to rise. The well knew I belonged here. We all did. The truth is, I think the well has always been here. Before the town, before the territory, before the first humans walked these hills. It's a mouth, feeding on something we can't understand, keeping something satisfied that we're better off not knowing. And we feed it because we have to. Because the alternative is worse. I'm 73 now, too old for this job but too scared to quit. My deputy is a good kid, smart, brave, eager to make a difference. But he doesn't understand yet. Doesn't know that some problems can't be solved, only managed. He will, though. Come October, he'll learn what Sheriff McCready tried to tell me all those years ago. It's always the same day. And we never ask who it belongs to. Because if we asked, we might not like the answer. The blood is rising again as I write this. I can smell it through the station windows. That familiar iron tang that means October has come around again. In a few hours, I'll drive out to the woods and take up my position, watching and waiting to see what tribute the well demands this year. Maybe it'll be satisfied with the usual offerings. Maybe it'll want something more. Either way, I'll be there. Because that's what the job requires. Not just keeping the peace, but keeping the balance. Making sure the old agreements are honored, the old hungers fed. It's not the kind of sheriffing they teach you in the academy. But it's the kind this town needs. The phone's ringing now. Probably Mrs. Patterson, wanting to know if she should keep her grandchildren inside tonight. I'll tell her yes, like I always do. Lock the doors, close the curtains, don't go out after dark. Some traditions are worth keeping, even when you don't fully understand them. Especially then. The well is waiting. It's always waiting. And tomorrow, when the sun rises on October 16th and the stones are clean and dry again, we'll all pretend that nothing happened. We'll go back to our normal lives, our normal problems, our normal fears. Until next year. Because it's always the same day. And we never ask who it belongs to. I dropped my flashlight when the boards under my boots throbbed. Not creaked. Not groaned. Throbbed. Like something alive was breathing underneath the old hunting cabin's floor, chest rising and falling in a rhythm that had nothing to do with wind or settling timber. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County for 37 years now, and I've seen enough strange things to fill a dozen case files. But that October evening in 1997, crouched in the dark of the Kessler cabin with my flashlight beam dancing across warped floorboards, I understood for the first time that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be survived. The whole thing started 3 weeks earlier when Billy Hartman came into my office with dirt under his fingernails and panic in his eyes. Billy ran a small hunting guide business out of his trailer on Route 9, taking city folk into the deep woods for deer and turkey. Quiet man, reliable, never caused trouble except for the occasional drunk and disorderly during hunting season. But that morning, Billy looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "Sheriff," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the careful movements of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "I need to report something." I set down my coffee and waited. In small towns, you learn to let people tell their stories at their own pace. Rush them, and they'll clam up faster than a threatened turtle. "It's about the old Kessler place," Billy continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Deep in the woods, maybe 6 miles past the logging road. My grandfather used to tell stories about that cabin. I knew the place he meant. The Kessler cabin had been built sometime in the 1920s by a man named Ernst Kessler, a German immigrant who'd wanted nothing more than to hunt and fish in peace. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by old-growth pine and oak, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through terrain so thick and tangled that most folks avoided it entirely. Ernst had disappeared in 1943. Just vanished one autumn day, leaving behind a half-eaten meal and a fire still burning in the hearth. His family back in town waited for him to return, but when spring came and the snow melted, all they found was the cabin, perfectly preserved but empty as a tomb. "What about it?" I asked Billy. He rubbed his hands on his jeans, leaving streaks of dirt. "I took a client out there yesterday. Rich fellow from Boston, wanted to hunt in the deep woods. Said he'd pay extra for the authentic experience." Billy paused, staring at something I couldn't see. "We set up camp about a quarter-mile from the cabin. My client, he was curious about it, wanted to explore. I told him no, but he was insistent. Paying customer, you know?" I nodded. Money talks, especially in a county where work is scarce and winter's always coming. So we went to have a look. Cabin's in better shape than it has any right to be, considering. Doors still solid, windows intact. But Sheriff, Billy's voice dropped even lower. The floor was moving. Moving how? Like breathing. Like something big was sleeping underneath, and the floorboards were rising and falling with each breath. I'd heard stranger things in my time as sheriff, but something about Billy's tone made the hair on my arms stand up. He wasn't lying. He wasn't drunk. He was scared. "Could have been animals," I suggested. "Bears sometimes den under structures." Billy shook his head. "No, Sheriff. This was different. Regular as a heartbeat. And the sound," he shuddered, "like a drum made of meat." I asked Billy to show me where the cabin was on the county map, and he traced a route with his finger that led deep into the Millbrook forest. The area was marked with old surveyor's marks and warnings about unstable terrain. "I'll check it out," I told him. "Sheriff," Billy said as he stood to leave, "my grandfather told me something once. Said the Kessler cabin was built on bad ground. Said some places in the woods remember things that happened long before any of us were born." After Billy left, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about what he'd said. Millbrook County had its share of local legends and ghost stories. Most of them were harmless, tales passed down through generations to keep children from wandering too far into the woods or swimming in the old quarry. But some stories, the ones told in hushed voices by old-timers who'd lived here all their lives, had a different quality to them. They felt less like entertainment and more like warnings. I decided to drive out to the Kessler cabin that afternoon. The logging road was rough, barely more than 2 tire tracks carved through the forest, and I had to park my cruiser at the trailhead. The walk to the cabin took 40 minutes through woods so thick that the afternoon sun barely penetrated the canopy. The trees in that part of the forest were old. Not just mature, but ancient, the kind of trees that had been saplings when the first settlers arrived. Their trunks were massive, their bark scarred by decades of weather and wildlife. The forest floor was carpeted with layers of fallen leaves that muffled my footsteps and made the woods feel unnaturally quiet. As I walked, I noticed things that shouldn't have been there. Scratch marks on tree trunks, too high and too deep to have been made by any animal I knew. Patches of ground where nothing grew, as if the soil itself had been poisoned. And everywhere, the smell of earth and decay, so thick I could taste it. The cabin sat in a clearing maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by a ring of pine trees that seemed to lean inward, as if they were trying to hide the structure from view. The building itself was small, maybe 12 feet by 16, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that sagged slightly to one side. The wood was dark with age and weather, but as Billy had said, it was in remarkably good condition. I approached slowly, my hand resting on the butt of my service revolver. Not because I expected trouble, but because something about the place made me want to be ready for anything. The door was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was exactly as Ernst Kessler had left it more than 50 years earlier. A table set for one, with a plate that still held the remains of what might have been a meal. A fire laid in the hearth, ready to light. A bed in the corner, neatly made. Everything covered in a thin layer of dust that seemed to sparkle in the filtered sunlight. But it was the floor that drew my attention. The floorboards were wide planks of pine, darkened with age and wear. They looked solid enough, but as I stood there, I thought I could feel something beneath them. A subtle vibration, like a distant train passing underground. I knelt and pressed my ear to the floor. For a moment, I heard nothing but the settling of old wood. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard it, a rhythmic thumping, slow and steady, like a massive heart beating far below. I stood up quickly, my own heart hammering in my chest. The sound stopped immediately, as if whatever was making it had sensed my presence and decided to wait. I left the cabin and walked back to my cruiser, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees. When I glanced back at the clearing, I saw nothing but shadows. That night, I called my predecessor, old Sheriff Moody, who'd retired to Florida but still kept in touch. Moody had been sheriff for 25 years before me, and he knew every story and legend in the county. "The Kessler place?" he said when I told him about my visit. "Haven't thought about that in years. Had a few calls about it over the years, but nothing ever came of them." "What kind of calls?" "Hunters mostly. Folks who'd gotten lost and stumbled across it. All told the same story, said the cabin felt wrong somehow. Like it was alive." Moody paused, and I could hear him lighting a cigarette. "There was one thing," he continued. "Back in '73, a geology student from the State University came to see me. Said he'd been doing research on the local geology, and had found something unusual about the area around the Kessler cabin." "What kind of unusual?" "He said the ground underneath the cabin was hollow. Not just a little cave or sinkhole, but a vast underground chamber. Said it was like the cabin was built on top of a bubble in the earth." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Did he investigate further?" "Planned to, but he never came back. I called the university, and they said he dropped out of school suddenly. Never finished his research." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about what Moody had told me. A hollow space beneath the cabin could explain the strange sounds Billy had heard. But it didn't explain the rhythmic nature of the noise, or the way the floorboards had seemed to pulse under my feet. I decided to return to the cabin the next day, this time with proper equipment. I borrowed a portable ground-penetrating radar unit from the county's emergency management office, along with a digital audio recorder and a high-powered flashlight. The second trip to the cabin took place on a gray, overcast morning that made the forest seem even more ominous than before. The trees creaked and groaned in the wind, and the air smelled of rain and rotting leaves. Inside the cabin, I set up the radar unit and began scanning the floor. The device immediately detected a large void beneath the structure, just as the geology student had claimed. But the shape of the void was strange, not the irregular cavity you'd expect from a natural cave, but something more organized, more purposeful. As I worked, I began to hear the sound again. The rhythmic thumping, growing stronger and more pronounced. I turned on the audio recorder and captured nearly 10 minutes of the steady, pulsing beat. Then I made a mistake that still haunts me. I decided to lift one of the floorboards and look into the space below. The board came up easily, as if it had been designed to be removed. Beneath it was a hole maybe 2 feet square, descending into darkness. I shone my flashlight into the opening and saw what looked like a natural cave system, but the walls were too smooth, too perfectly curved. The smell that rose from the hole was indescribable. Not decay, exactly, but something organic and alive. Something that had been breathing the same air for decades, growing stronger in the darkness. I heard movement below. Not the scurrying of animals or the drip of water, but something large shifting position. The thumping sound grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was down there had sensed my presence and was responding to it. I replaced the floorboard quickly and packed up my equipment. But as I prepared to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The dust on the floor around the hole was disturbed, as if something had been coming up through the opening on a regular basis. And there, in the soft dirt near the door, I saw footprints that definitely hadn't been there during my first visit. The prints were human, but wrong somehow. Too long, with spaces between the toes that suggested bare feet. And they were fresh, made sometime in the last few hours. I followed the prints outside, where they led from the cabin to the edge of the clearing, and then disappeared into the forest. But not before I noticed something else that made me reach for my radio to call for backup. The prints were walking away from the cabin, but they were facing backward, as if whatever had made them had been walking in reverse. My deputy, Sarah Chin, met me at the trailhead an hour later. Sarah was young but competent, with a degree in criminal justice and a healthy skepticism about small-town folklore. I told her about the footprints and the sounds, but I could see she was having trouble believing it. "Could be someone's playing a prank," she suggested as we walked back to the cabin. "Maybe Billy Hartman is trying to drum up business with a ghost story." "Billy's not the type," I said, but I didn't blame her for being skeptical. If someone had told me the same story, I'd have assumed they were either lying or crazy. We reached the cabin just as the sun was beginning to set. The place looked different in the fading light, more menacing, more alive. The shadows seemed deeper, and the silence was so complete it felt oppressive. Inside, the cabin was exactly as I'd left it, but the floorboard I'd lifted was slightly askew, as if something had pushed it up from below. Sarah noticed it immediately. "Did you leave it like that?" she asked. "No," I said, kneeling to examine the board. "I made sure it was secure." Sarah knelt beside me and pressed her ear to the floor. For a moment, she frowned, concentrating. Then her eyes widened. "I hear it," she whispered. "It sounds like a heartbeat," I finished. We listened together as the sound grew stronger, more insistent. The floorboards began to vibrate under our knees, and I could feel the rhythm through my whole body. Sarah reached for her radio, but I grabbed her wrist. "Wait," I said. "Listen." The sound was changing. What had been a steady, rhythmic thumping was becoming more complex. Now it sounded like multiple heartbeats, overlapping and echoing, as if a crowd of people were gathering in the space below. Then we heard the voices. They were faint at first, barely more than whispers rising from the darkness beneath the cabin. But as we listened, they grew clearer, more distinct. Men's voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The words were guttural, alien, but the tone was unmistakable. They were calling out, as if they were trying to communicate with us. Sarah started to stand, but I pulled her back down. Something told me that moving, that acknowledging what we were hearing, would be a mistake. The voices continued for several minutes, growing in volume and intensity. Then, abruptly, they stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. That's when I dropped my flashlight. The beam flickered as it hit the floor, casting wild shadows across the cabin walls. In the dancing light, I saw something that made my throat close up with terror. The floorboards were moving. Not just vibrating, but actually rising and falling in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The entire floor was breathing, as if the cabin had become a living thing. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "Sheriff," she whispered, "we need to leave." "Now." But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the sight of the breathing floor, by the impossible reality of what I was witnessing. The boards rose and fell with mechanical precision, and with each breath, I could hear the whispers growing louder. Then the floorboard I'd lifted earlier began to slide aside, revealing the dark opening beneath. Something was coming up from the hole, something that moved with purpose and intelligence. I finally found the strength to move. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the door, but she resisted. "The equipment," she said. "We need to document this." "Leave it," I snapped, dragging her outside. We ran across the clearing and into the forest, crashing through the underbrush like animals fleeing a predator. Behind us, I could hear the cabin settling back into silence, as if nothing had happened. We didn't stop running until we reached my cruiser. Only then did I realize that Sarah was crying. "What was that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What was under the cabin?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. We drove back to town in silence, both of us trying to process what we'd experienced. The next morning, I filed a report with the county commissioner, recommending that the area around the Kessler cabin be declared off-limits to the public. I cited safety concerns about unstable ground and potential cave-ins. The commissioner, a practical man who lived in Millbrook County his entire life, didn't ask many questions. He signed the order without hesitation, as if he'd been expecting it. 3 days later, I returned to the cabin alone. I needed to retrieve the equipment I'd left behind, but more than that, I needed to understand what had happened. The experience had left me feeling unmoored, as if everything I thought I knew about the world had been called into question. The forest was quiet as I approached the clearing, but there was something different about it. The trees seemed more twisted, more gnarled. The air smelled of earth and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in a vase. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, as if it had sunk slightly into the ground. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly open, revealing nothing but shadows inside. I approached carefully, my hand on my weapon. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but they felt solid, normal. The equipment I'd left was still there, untouched. The audio recorder was still running, though the battery should have died hours ago. I played back the recording, fast-forwarding through hours of silence until I reached the point where Sarah and I had heard the voices. But when I listened to the playback, all I heard was static. Whatever had been speaking from beneath the cabin hadn't been captured by the recording. I packed up the equipment and prepared to leave, but something made me pause. The floorboard I'd lifted was still slightly askew, and in the gap, I could see something that hadn't been there before. It was a piece of paper, yellowed with age, folded into a small square. I pulled it out and unfolded it carefully. The paper was covered with handwriting in faded ink, German words written in an archaic script. I couldn't read German, but I recognized one word that appeared several times throughout the text. Kessler. I took the paper to Dr. Hoffman, a retired professor of German literature who lived in town. He examined the document for a long time before speaking. "This is very old," he said finally. "Early 19th century, I would guess. The writing is difficult to read, but it appears to be some kind of ritual instruction." "Ritual for what?" Dr. Hoffman looked uncomfortable. "It's hard to say. The language is archaic, full of terms I don't recognize. but it seems to be describing a way to communicate with something that lives underground. He pointed to a passage near the bottom of the page. This part here mentions the sleepers beneath and the calling of the deep hearts. It's very strange, almost like a religious text, but not from any religion I'm familiar with. I left the document with Dr. Hoffman and asked him to translate as much as he could. 2 days later, he called me with results that made my hands shake as I wrote them down. According to the translation, the document was a set of instructions left by Ernst Kessler's grandfather, who had emigrated from a small village in the Bavarian forest. The village had been built over what the locals called Der Herzschlag der Erde, the heartbeat of the earth. The document described a ritual that had been performed for generations, a way of appeasing something that lived deep underground. The ritual involved building a structure over the breathing place, and making regular offerings to keep the sleepers calm. The final entry, written in a different hand, was dated 1943, the year Ernst Kessler disappeared. It was a single sentence. The offerings are no longer enough. They are waking up. I never returned to the Kessler cabin after that. I had the trail marked as unsafe and posted warning signs, but I knew that wouldn't stop everyone. Over the years, I've had occasional reports from hikers and hunters who've stumbled across the place. Their stories are always the same: a cabin in the woods where the floor breathes like a living thing, and voices can be heard calling from beneath the earth. Most people assume they're just stories, campfire tales meant to scare tourists and city folk. But I know better. I know that some places in the world are older than human memory, older than human understanding. I know that there are things sleeping beneath our feet that have been there since before the first trees took root, before the first animals walked on land. And I know that every year, on the anniversary of the night Sarah and I heard the voices, the calls to the sheriff's office increase. Reports of strange sounds in the forest, of footprints that face the wrong direction, of dreams filled with whispers and languages that don't exist. The Kessler cabin is still there, still breathing, still calling to whatever sleeps in the depths below. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the trees and the old building settles and creaks, I wonder if Ernst Kessler is still down there, still making his offerings, still trying to keep the sleepers from waking up completely. Because if they ever do wake up, if they ever decide that the offerings aren't enough and they want something more, then God help us all. The earth has a heartbeat, and it's getting stronger. Every year, it's getting stronger. And someday, something is going to answer back. I asked her who she was. She just smiled, left footprints in soot, and vanished. That was 37 years ago, and I still wake up some nights with the taste of smoke in my mouth, though I quit cigarettes back in '89. The girl, if that's what she was, left more than footprints that day. She left questions that burrow into a man's sleep like ticks, feeding on doubt until they're fat with unease. Millbrook's always been the kind of town where unusual things get explained away before coffee gets cold. We had our share of peculiarities. The church bell that rang at 3:17 every morning for 6 months in 1963, the way cats disappeared during odd-numbered years, how the Grayson Farms corn grew in perfect spirals after old Henrik died. Small towns digest strange happenings the way stomachs handle too much whiskey, slow, unpleasant, but eventually forgotten. But some things resist digestion. I was 43 when it started, with 16 years of sheriff's work under my belt and the comfortable assumption that I'd seen most of what this corner of eastern Idaho had to offer. Millbrook sat in a valley like a coffee stain on green cloth, surrounded by hills that turned purple at sunset and held their secrets close. Population 847 on a good day, 841 when the Hendricks family was visiting relatives in Boise. The first fire happened on a Tuesday in late September. The Kowalski place, out where Elm Street turns to gravel and hope turns to habit. Margaret Kowalski was 86, lived alone since her husband Paul went to sleep one winter night in '78 and decided not to wake up. The house had been in their family since 1923, weathered gray clapboard with a porch that sagged like a frown. I got the call at 6:42 p.m. By the time I arrived, the volunteer fire department was already losing the battle. The house burned with an eagerness that seemed almost hungry, flames licking through windows like tongues tasting the evening air. The old timbers must have been dry as paper, because the fire moved through that structure like it had been planned, systematic and thorough. Margaret stood in her front yard, clutching a photo album and wearing the same blue house dress she'd worn to the grocery store that morning. Soot streaked her cheeks, but her eyes were clear, fixed on something behind me. When I turned to follow her gaze, I saw her. The girl couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13. She stood at the edge of the Kowalski property where the light from the fire met the gathering darkness. Her hair hung in dark strings around a pale face, and she was covered, completely covered, in ash. It clung to her skin like gray snow, to her clothes like a second layer of fabric. But she wasn't moving, wasn't coughing, wasn't doing any of the things a person does when they've been too close to smoke and flame. She was smiling. "Margaret," I said, not taking my eyes off the girl. "Who is that?" Margaret followed my pointing finger, squinted into the firelight. "Who's what, Sheriff?" When I looked back, the girl was gone. Just gone, like smoke disperses when you wave your hand through it. But there, in the dirt where she'd been standing, were small footprints. Perfect impressions in the ash that had started to settle from the fire, as if she'd been standing there long enough for the debris to outline her feet. I walked over to examine the prints. They were small, narrow, the kind a child would make. But they were filled with ash, not just dusted with it, but packed full, as if she'd been standing there when the ash fell and her feet had been made of the stuff itself. "Curious," I muttered, crouching down for a better look. "What's that, Sheriff?" Margaret had followed me over, still clutching her photo album. "Nothing, Margaret. Just nothing." But it wasn't nothing. The footprints were too perfect, too detailed. I could see the outline of what looked like bare feet, complete with the impression of toes. No shoes, no socks, just skin against dirt. Except skin doesn't usually leave such precise impressions unless it's pressing down for a long time, and I'd been watching that spot for less than 2 minutes. The fire department got the blaze contained by 8:30, but the Kowalski house was a total loss. Nothing left but a blackened foundation and the stone chimney standing like a lonely monument. Margaret went to stay with her sister on Pine Street, and I filed a report that mentioned everything except the girl and the footprints. Some things you keep to yourself until you understand them better. The second fire came 3 weeks later. The Morrison farm, 5 miles out of town on Highway 34. Different circumstances. Electrical fire in the barn, started around midnight. But by the time I got there, history was repeating itself with uncomfortable precision. Jake Morrison and his wife Elena stood in their driveway, watching their barn collapse in on itself like a dying animal folding its legs. The smell of burning hay mixed with something else, something sharper and more acrid that made the back of my throat itch. And there she was again. This time she stood near the old oak tree at the edge of the Morrison property. The same tree where Jake's grandfather had hanged himself in 1934. She was closer now, maybe 30 yards away, and I could see her more clearly in the firelight. The ash covered her like a second skin, but underneath it, her clothes looked old-fashioned. A simple dress, maybe white originally, now gray with soot. Her feet were indeed bare, and as I watched, she took a single step forward. The ash fell from her foot as she lifted it, drifted down like snow, and when she placed it back on the ground, More ash seemed to flow up from the earth to replace what had fallen, as if the ground itself was feeding her that gray coating. "Elena," I called, not looking away from the girl. "You see that child over by the oak?" Elena squinted into the darkness, following my gaze. "What child, Sheriff?" "There's nobody there." This time I kept watching, didn't look away for even a second. The girl raised one hand, small, delicate, covered in ash like everything else about her, and waved at me. A slow, deliberate wave, the kind you give to someone you know well. Then she turned and walked into the darkness beyond the oak tree. I followed. The ground around the oak was soft from recent rain, perfect for taking impressions. I found her footprints easily enough, small and bare and filled with ash. But these prints led away from the tree, through the tall grass toward the creek that ran behind the Morrison property. I followed them for maybe 50 yards, using my flashlight to track the ash-filled impressions in the soft earth. Then they stopped. Not gradually, not like she'd reached harder ground where footprints wouldn't show. They just stopped, mid-stride, as if she'd taken a step into empty air and kept walking through it. The last print was half-formed, the front part of a foot pressed into the mud with the heel section missing, like she'd been in the process of taking another step when she simply ceased to exist. I spent the better part of an hour looking for where the trail picked up again. Searched in widening circles, checked the creek bank, even waded across to the other side. Nothing. The girl had walked 50 yards through soft mud and then vanished as completely as morning dew. When I got back to the barn, the fire was out and the structure was nothing but smoldering timber and twisted metal. Jake was poking through the ruins with a long stick, looking for anything salvageable. "Find anything interesting out there, Sheriff?" he asked without looking up. "Just checking the perimeter," I said, making sure nobody was hurt. But I was lying, and part of me suspected Jake knew it. There's a quality to silence in small towns, a way it settles over uncomfortable truths like dust covers on furniture. Some things are better left undisturbed. The third fire happened in November, just as the first snow was starting to dust the hills around Millbrook. The old Grange Hall on Main Street, built in 1889 and used for everything from town meetings to wedding receptions. It went up on a Thursday night, around 10 p.m., while most of the town was home watching television or settling into bed. I was at the station, finishing paperwork, when I saw the orange glow through my office window. By the time I got to Main Street, half the town was already there, standing in scattered groups on the sidewalk, watching the building burn with the kind of fascination people reserve for disasters they're not personally involved in. The Grange Hall burned differently than the other fires. Slower, more methodical, as if the flames were taking time to examine each board, each nail, before consuming it. The old building had good bones, thick timber frame, solid construction, but the fire moved through it with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. She was standing in front of Hendrick's hardware store, directly across the street from the burning building. Closer than she'd ever been before, close enough that I could see details I'd missed in the previous sightings. The ash that covered her wasn't random, wasn't just debris that had settled on her skin and clothes. It formed patterns, swirls and spirals that moved and shifted as I watched, as if the ash was alive, constantly rearranging itself across her surface. Her dress, definitely white originally, hung in tatters that seemed to move independent of any breeze. And her eyes, when she turned to look directly at me, were completely black. Not dark brown, not pupil-dilated black, but the absolute black of a moonless night or the bottom of a deep well. This time I didn't ask anyone else if they could see her. I'd learned that lesson. Instead, I walked directly toward her, crossing Main Street through the crowd of onlookers who were all facing the burning building. None of them seemed to notice me walking past, or if they did, they didn't think it worth mentioning. The girl watched me approach. That smile was still there, but it wasn't the innocent smile of a child. It was knowing, ancient, the smile of something that had seen too much and remembered all of it. When I was maybe 10 feet away, she spoke. "You can see me." Her voice was like the sound of ash falling on glass, soft and gritty at the same time. "I can see you," I confirmed, stopping where I was. Something about getting closer seemed like a bad idea, though I couldn't have explained why. "Most can't. Most don't need to." She tilted her head, considering this. Ash fell from her hair like dandruff, drifted down to add to the gray coating on her dress. "You're not afraid." "Should I be?" That smile widened slightly. "Everyone should be afraid of fire, Sheriff. Fire changes things. Makes them different. Sometimes makes them better. And sometimes it just burns them down." "Yes," she agreed. "Sometimes it does that too." The conversation felt surreal, standing in the middle of Main Street talking to a child made of ash while the Grange Hall burned behind us. The heat from the fire was intense, even at this distance, but the girl seemed unaffected by it. If anything, she looked more solid, more present, as if the flames were feeding her somehow. "What's your name?" I asked. "Names are for people who stay in one place," she said. "I go where the fire goes." "Where do you come from?" "From the places that burn." She raised one ash-covered hand and pointed at the Grange Hall. "From there. And there." She pointed toward where the Kowalski house had stood, then toward the Morrison farm. "Fire makes doors, Sheriff. I walked through them." Before I could ask what she meant, she took a step backward. Then another. With each step, she became less solid, more translucent, as if she was dissolving into the night air. By the 5th step, she was gone completely, leaving only a small pile of ash where she'd been standing. I knelt down and examined the ash. It was warm to the touch, almost hot, and when I rubbed some between my fingers, it felt different from normal ash. Grittier, with a texture that reminded me of sand from a beach I'd visited as a child. But there were no beaches within 500 miles of Millbrook. The Grange Hall burned until dawn. Nothing left but the stone foundation and a few metal support beams twisted into shapes that hurt to look at. The town council met the following week to discuss rebuilding, but somehow the subject never came up again. The lot sat empty, grew weeds, became one of those places children dared each other to walk past after dark. Winter came early that year, settled over Millbrook like a gray blanket that someone had forgotten to wash. The snow was heavier than usual, the temperatures colder, and people stayed indoors more than they typically did. The town felt different, quieter, as if the fires had changed something fundamental about the place we all called home. I started having dreams. They were always the same. I'd be standing in a room filled with smoke, calling out for someone whose voice I could hear but whose words I couldn't understand. The smoke would get thicker, more choking, until I couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't do anything but stumble blindly through the gray haze looking for a door that was never there. And always, just before I woke up, I'd hear her laughing. That same child's laugh, but filtered through smoke and distance until it sounded like something that had been laughing for a very long time. The dreams got worse after Christmas. More frequent, more vivid, more real. I'd wake up with the taste of smoke in my mouth and the smell of ash in my hair. My wife Sarah started sleeping in the guest room, said I was talking in my sleep, saying things that didn't make sense but made her uncomfortable. "You keep asking where the doors are," she told me one morning over coffee. "What doors, Tom?" I couldn't explain because I didn't understand it myself. But the dreams felt important, like my subconscious was trying to tell me something my waking mind wasn't ready to accept. The answer came in February, during the worst blizzard Millbrook had seen in 20 years. The power was out across half the county, phone lines were down, and the roads were impassable. I was at the station, running the place on backup generator power, and trying to coordinate with the state police over a radio that worked about half the time. That's when the call came in from Doc Peterson. Peterson ran the only medical clinic in town, worked out of a converted house on Maple Street that had served as everything from a boarding house to a speakeasy over the years. He was 73, had been taking care of Millbrook's medical needs for 42 years, and in all that time, I'd never heard him sound rattled. He sounded rattled now. "Tom, you need to get over here. Now." "What's the problem, Doc?" "Just get over here." "And Tom? Bring a camera." The roads were treacherous, ice under snow under more ice, but I made it to the clinic in my four-wheel drive patrol car. Peterson was waiting for me at the front door, his face pale in the glow of the battery-powered lantern he was holding. "She's in the back room," he said without preamble. "Found her about an hour ago, collapsed in the snow behind the building. No coat, no shoes, covered in ash like she'd been in a fire." "But Tom," he paused, ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. "There haven't been any fires. Not for months." I followed him through the darkened clinic to the examination room in the back. Peterson had set up several lanterns, and in their combined glow, I could see a small figure on the examination table, covered with a white sheet. "She's unconscious," Peterson said. "Hypothermia, probably, though her body temperature is strange. Too high for someone who's been out in the cold, too low for someone who's healthy. And the ash." He pulled back the sheet. "It was her. The girl from the fires, though she looked different now. Smaller, more fragile, more human. The ash still covered her, but it was patchy, uneven, as if it was slowly flaking away to reveal pale skin underneath. Her hair was matted with the gray powder, and her breathing was shallow but steady." "Have you tried to clean her up?" I asked. "That's the thing, Tom. I tried washing the ash off her hands and arms. Used warm water, soap, even scrubbed a little. It won't come off. It's not on her skin, it is her skin. Or part of it anyway. Like it's grown into her somehow." I leaned closer, studying her face. Without the knowing smile, without those black eyes open and watching, she looked like any other child. Vulnerable. Lost. Human. "Any idea who she might be?" Peterson asked. I could have told him about the fires, about seeing her at each scene, about the footprints filled with ash. Could have shared my dreams and my growing suspicion that this girl was connected to something that went deeper than a few random structure fires in a small Idaho town. Instead, I said, "No missing persons reports that match her description." Which was true, as far as it went. Peterson nodded, pulled the sheet back up to her chin. "I'll keep her here tonight, see how she responds. Maybe she'll be able to tell us something when she wakes up." But I had a feeling she wouldn't wake up. Not here, not like this. Whatever she was, wherever she came from, this wasn't her natural state. She belonged in the fire, in the smoke, in the spaces between burning and burned. I stayed at the clinic until dawn, dozing fitfully in a chair beside her bed. Every time I started to fall asleep, I'd hear that distant laughter, see smoke curling at the edges of my vision. The girl didn't move, didn't stir, barely seemed to breathe. When the sun finally came up, painting the snow-covered town in shades of pink and gold, I checked on her one last time before heading back to the station. She looked even smaller in the morning light, more fragile, as if she was slowly fading away. "Call me if anything changes," I told Peterson. He nodded, but we both knew nothing was going to change. Some things exist in the spaces between normal and impossible, and trying to drag them into the light of ordinary day just makes them disappear. The girl was gone by noon. Peterson called, voice tight with confusion and something that might have been fear. "She's not here, Tom. I checked on her around 11:30, and the room was empty. No sign of struggle, no indication of how she got out. The doors are all locked from the inside, windows too. She just isn't here anymore." I drove back to the clinic, examined the room myself. Peterson was right. No obvious explanation for how a child, especially one in her condition, could have simply vanished from a locked room. But there was something he missed, something I might have missed too if I hadn't been looking for it. Ash. A thin layer of gray ash covered the examination table where she'd been lying. Not scattered randomly, but arranged in the precise outline of a small human form. Arms, legs, torso, head, all outlined in ash as if she'd simply crumbled away, leaving only her shadow behind. I ran my finger through the ash, brought it to my nose. Same smell as before, that odd mixture of wood smoke and something else, something that reminded me of places I'd never been and times I'd never lived through. "Peterson," I said, "I need you to forget about this." He looked at me like I'd suggested he forget his own name. "Forget about what?" "The girl. The ash. All of it. File a report that says you treated someone for hypothermia, they recovered and left. Nothing more." "Tom, I can't." "You can and you will. Some things are better left alone. Document, trust me on this." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Peterson was a smart man, smart enough to recognize when he was standing at the edge of something he didn't want to understand. Spring came late that year, didn't really take hold until mid-April. The snow melted gradually, revealing a town that looked subtly different, though it took me weeks to figure out what had changed. The buildings seemed older somehow, more weathered, as if the winter had aged them beyond the normal passage of time. Paint was more faded, wood was more warped, metal was more rusted. The places where the fires had burned remained empty. Nobody talked about rebuilding the Kowalski house or the Morrison barn. The Grange Hall lot grew thick with weeds that seemed too green, too vigorous, fed by soil that had been enriched by ash and memory. I thought the girl was gone for good, thought whatever force had brought her to Millbrook had finally released its hold. The dreams stopped, the taste of smoke faded from my mornings, and life returned to something approaching normal. I was wrong. The fourth fire came in late June, during the hottest summer Millbrook had seen in 30 years. The old Lutheran church on the north side of town, built in 1901 and maintained by a congregation that had dwindled to fewer than 20 regular attendees. It burned on a Sunday night, 3 hours after evening services had ended. I saw the glow from my house, 5 miles away. By the time I got to the church, the building was already half gone. The steeple collapsed into the nave like a broken spine. The volunteer fire department was there, but they were fighting a losing battle. The church burned with the same hungry eagerness I'd seen in the other fires, as if the flames had been waiting for this moment, planning for it. She stood in the cemetery behind the church, among the weathered headstones and overgrown grass. But she looked different now, older somehow, more substantial. The ash still covered her, but it had texture now, depth, as if it had been accumulating for months. Her dress was more tattered, her hair longer and more tangled, her smile wider and more knowing. This time I didn't hesitate. I walked directly to her, threading my way between the tilted headstones and marble angels that presided over Millbrook's dead. "You're back," I said. "I never left." Her voice was stronger now, more present, though it still carried that quality of ash falling on glass. "I was sleeping." "In the clinic?" "In the fire." "Fire sleeps sometimes, Sheriff. Waits. Gathers strength." I looked back at the burning church, at the flames that seemed to reach toward the star-filled sky like grasping fingers. "What do you want?" "What fire always wants," To burn. To change. To make things different. Different how? She gestured toward the town spread out below us, toward the lights and windows and the smoke rising from chimneys. This place is old, Sheriff. Older than the buildings, older than the streets, older than the people who think they live here. It remembers things. Holds them close. Fire helps it remember. Remember what? The first fire. The one that made all the others possible. Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and walked deeper into the cemetery, moving between the headstones with the easy familiarity of someone who had walked this path many times before. I followed, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of her, illuminating fragments of carved names and dates that told the story of everyone who had lived and died in Millbrook over the past century and a half. She stopped at the far edge of the cemetery, where the maintained graves gave way to older plots, stones so weathered that the inscriptions were barely legible. Here, the girl knelt beside a grave marker that was little more than a rough piece of granite jutting from the earth. "Read it," she said. I knelt beside her, shined my light on the stone. The carving was primitive, shallow, almost worn away by time and weather. But I could make out the words. "Here lies Anna Walsh. Died in the fire. 1878. She burns still." "Anna Walsh," I said. "Never heard that name. You wouldn't have. The records were lost. Destroyed. Forgotten. But the earth remembers. The fire remembers. What happened to her?" The girl, Anna, I realize now, turned to look at me with those black eyes. "The same thing that's happening now. Fire found her. Changed her. Made her different." "Different how?" "She became the fire, Sheriff. And the fire became her. When her body burned, her spirit remained. Waiting. Watching. Learning." The burning church behind us collapsed with a sound like the world sighing, sending sparks and embers high into the night sky. Some of those embers drifted toward us, glowing orange against the darkness, but they didn't land randomly. They fell in patterns, forming shapes and symbols I didn't recognize but that seemed familiar somehow, as if I'd seen them in dreams I couldn't quite remember. "Every fire since then has been her fire," Anna continued. "Every flame that burns in this town carries a piece of her spirit. She's been growing stronger, more present, more real. And now..." "Now what?" Anna smiled that ancient smile. "Now she's ready to come home." The temperature around us began to rise. Not gradually, but suddenly, as if someone had opened an oven door. The grass at our feet started to smolder, thin wisps of smoke rising from the earth. The weathered headstones began to heat up, the marble ones starting to glow faintly in the darkness. "You need to leave," Anna said, standing up. "All of you. Tonight. That's not possible. People have lives here, homes, businesses. They have illusions," she interrupted. "This town has been burning for over a century, Sheriff. Slow, patient, invisible burning. But still burning. And when Anna Walsh comes home, when she finally has enough fire to take physical form again, this place will burn clean. Everything. Everyone." The heat was becoming unbearable. My uniform shirt was soaking with sweat, my badge was getting hot enough to burn my chest. The air itself seemed to shimmer, distorting everything beyond a few feet in any direction. "How long do we have?" I asked. "Until the next fire. The big one. The one that brings her back." "When?" Anna started to fade, becoming translucent as the heat grew more intense. "Soon, Sheriff. Very soon. And when it comes, don't try to fight it. Fire always wins." She was gone then, dissolved into the superheated air like sugar dissolving in water. I stumbled back toward the burning church, gasping in the relatively cooler air, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd learned. The church burned until morning, leaving nothing but a foundation and a few metal fixtures twisted into impossible shapes. The congregation held a meeting the following week to discuss rebuilding, but like the others before it, the subject somehow never came up again. The lot sat empty, grew weeds, became another place children dared each other to approach after dark. I spent the next 3 weeks trying to figure out what to do with the information Anna had given me. Evacuate the entire town based on the word of a girl made of ash who claimed to be channeling the spirit of someone who died in 1878. Even if I could convince anyone to listen, where would we go? How do you relocate 847 people on the basis of a supernatural threat that no one else could see? The answer, I realized, was that you don't. You can't. Some knowledge is too large for normal life to accommodate, too strange for ordinary people to accept. All you can do is wait, and watch, and try to be ready for whatever comes next. The fifth fire came on the last day of July. I was in my office at the station, working late on a case involving some missing cattle from the Henderson Ranch, when every light in the building went out at once. Not flickering, not gradual dimming, but instant, complete darkness. The backup generator didn't kick in. The emergency lighting didn't activate. Even my battery-powered radio went silent. Then I saw the glow. It started as a faint orange light through my office window, barely visible at first, but growing stronger by the second. I went to the window and looked out at Millbrook's main street, and what I saw there has stayed with me every day since. Fire was rising from the ground. Not spreading from a single source, not starting with one building and moving to the next, but emerging simultaneously from dozens of different points throughout the town. It bubbled up through sidewalk cracks, seeped out from storm drains, flowed like luminous water from every opening that connected to the spaces beneath Millbrook's carefully maintained surface. And in that fire, taking shape like sculpture forming itself from molten bronze, was Anna Walsh. She was magnificent and terrible, 20 feet tall and growing larger, composed entirely of flame and shadow and something that might have been memory given physical form. Her hair flowed like liquid fire. Her dress rippled like burning silk. Her eyes were pits of flame so bright they hurt to look at directly. The town was burning, but it wasn't being destroyed. It was being transformed. Buildings that caught fire didn't collapse. They became more themselves, more what they had always been meant to be. The hardware store became a cathedral of twisted metal and burning wood. The post office became a tower of flame letters spelling out messages in a language I didn't recognize. The houses became something between homes and altars, places where fire could rest and plan and remember. And the people. I could see them through the windows of the burning buildings, but they weren't running, weren't screaming, weren't doing any of the things people do when their world catches fire. They were standing still, faces turned upward toward Anna Walsh's towering form, expressions peaceful and accepting, as if they'd been waiting for this moment their entire lives. Maybe they had been. I grabbed my keys and ran for the patrol car, thinking I could drive to the next town, get help, call in the National Guard or the fire department from Boise or someone who could deal with whatever this was. But the car wouldn't start. The engine didn't even turn over, as if the fire had somehow reached into the mechanical spaces and claimed them too. So I ran. I ran through streets that were rivers of flame, past buildings that burned without being consumed, around people who stood motionless as living torches. The fire didn't hurt me. It should have. The heat should have killed me in the first 30 seconds. But it flowed around me like I was a rock in a stream, leaving me untouched but trapped within its current. I ran until I reached the edge of town, where Millbrook ended and the normal world was supposed to begin. But there was no edge anymore. The fire stretched as far as I could see in every direction, an ocean of flame that had swallowed the valley, the hills, everything I'd thought I knew about the geography of my home. That's when I understood. Anna Walsh hadn't come back to destroy Millbrook. She'd come back to reveal what Millbrook had always been underneath its coat of paint and pretense. A fire that had been burning since 1878, fed by every flame that had ever been lit within the town limits, growing stronger and more real with each passing year until it had enough substance to show itself. We hadn't been living in a town. We'd been living inside a fire. I turned around and walked back toward the center of town, toward Anna Walsh's towering form. There was nowhere else to go, no escape from something that had been our reality all along without us knowing it. As I got closer, she turned to look down at me, her face a shifting pattern of flame and shadow. "You see now," she said, her voice the sound of 1,000 fires speaking in unison. "I see," I admitted. "Will you tell them?" I looked around at the people of Millbrook, still standing motionless in their burning world, faces peaceful and accepting. "Would they believe me?" "No," she said. "But you'll tell them anyway. Because that's what sheriffs do. They tell the truth, even when the truth is too large for anyone to hold." She was right, of course. I would tell them, or try to. I'd write reports that no one would file, give testimony that no one would record, share a story that no one would believe. Because some truths are too important to keep to yourself, even when, especially when, they're impossible. The fire burned until dawn, then slowly subsided, sinking back into the ground and the spaces between buildings, returning to its long, patient slumber. By the time the sun was fully up, Millbrook looked exactly as it had the day before. Same buildings, same streets, same people going about their morning routines as if nothing had happened. But I could still smell the smoke. Could still see the places where the fire had revealed the truth hiding underneath our ordinary lives. Could still hear Anna Walsh's voice carried on every breeze that stirred the ash-fertilized weeds growing in the empty lots where buildings had burned and been forgotten. I retired 3 months later, moved to Boise, tried to build a new life in a place where the ground didn't remember things it was supposed to forget. But you can't escape a fire that burns inside your memory. And every night when I close my eyes, I'm back in Millbrook, watching Anna Walsh rise from the earth like a phoenix made of all the fires that ever were and ever would be. Sarah thinks I'm developing dementia, the way I sometimes wake up talking about fires and ash and footprints that lead nowhere. My doctor says it's trauma, post-retirement stress, the mind's way of processing years of accumulated tension. They prescribe pills and therapy and quiet activities to keep my thoughts from wandering too far into dark places. They mean well, but they don't understand. Some fires never go out. They just burn lower, wait longer, gather strength for the next time they'll be needed. And sometimes, on nights when the wind is right and the moon is dark, I can still smell the smoke. Can still see a girl made of ash standing at the edge of vision, smiling that ancient smile, waiting for the next fire to begin. I asked her who she was, 37 years ago. She just smiled, left footprints in soot, and vanished. But she didn't really vanish. Fire never does. It just waits. It called my name last night. And I'm not sure how many more dawns I've got left. 37 years I wore the badge in Hollow Creek, Maine. 37 years of drunk and disorderlies, domestic disputes, and the occasional break-in at Morrison's hardware store. The kind of place where excitement meant the high school football team making it to regionals. And the biggest scandal was when old Mrs. Henley was caught stealing communion wine from the Methodist church. I thought I'd seen everything a small town could throw at an aging lawman. I was wrong. The trouble started 3 Septembers ago, though I reckon the seeds were planted long before that. Hollow Creek sits in a natural depression between 2 ridges of pine and granite, the kind of geographical accident that traps sound and holds on to weather longer than it should. The old-timers used to say the town was built in God's cupped palm, but after what I witnessed, I'm inclined to think it was something else's palm entirely. The first disappearance happened on a Tuesday. Martha Connolly, 63, retired postal worker who'd lived in the same white Cape Cod on Elm Street for 4 decades. Her neighbor called it in when Martha's newspapers started piling up and her tabby cat was yowling something fierce on the front porch. I found her house exactly as she'd left it. Coffee still warm in the pot, morning crossword puzzle half finished on the kitchen table. The Today Show was playing to an empty living room, and her reading glasses were folded neatly beside yesterday's mail. Nothing disturbed, nothing stolen. Martha had simply vanished between breakfast and her morning walk. The peculiar thing was the door. Not that it was locked or unlocked, but the way it stood slightly ajar, maybe 3 inches, like someone had opened it to listen for something outside and never quite closed it again. When I pushed it wider, the hinges made a sound like a sigh. I canvassed the neighborhood, talked to everyone on her street. Mrs. Patterson, who lived across the way, mentioned she'd seen Martha step outside around 8:30 that morning. But when I pressed her for details, she got that faraway look people get when they're trying to remember a dream. There was something thick in the air, she said, wrapping her housecoat tighter around her shoulders despite the warmth of the afternoon. Made it hard to see clear. Martha just walked into it. I figured she meant the morning mist that sometimes settled in the low places around town. Nothing unusual about that. But something in the way Mrs. Patterson said it, the way her voice dropped to barely a whisper, made the hair on my arms stand up. We organized search parties, called in volunteers from 3 neighboring towns. For 5 days we combed every square inch of forest, checked every abandoned building, dragged the creek that ran behind the elementary school. The state police sent a helicopter. We found nothing. Not so much as a footprint, or a scrap of clothing. Martha Connolly had simply ceased to exist. The second disappearance came 2 weeks later. Tommy Briggs, 17, star quarterback on the high school team and the kind of kid who said yes sir, and no ma'am, without being reminded. His parents called at dawn, voices shaky with that particular terror that comes when your child's bed hasn't been slept in. This time I got there faster, and this time I noticed things I'd missed before. The front door of the Briggs house stood open the same way Martha's had, just a crack, like an invitation or a question mark. Tommy's truck was still in the driveway, keys on the kitchen counter. His homework lay spread across his desk, a half-written essay about career goals that would never be finished. But it was Tommy's younger sister who told me something that made my blood run cold. He said he heard someone calling him, she whispered, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. Around midnight. I heard him get up and go to the window, and he said, "That's my name." Someone saying my name. I asked her if she'd heard it too. She shook her head, but her eyes held the same distant quality Mrs. Patterson's had, like she was looking at something the rest of us couldn't see. "There was that thick stuff outside again," she said. "The white stuff that makes everything quiet." The search for Tommy lasted a week. This time we brought in dogs, specialists from Portland, even called in favors with the FBI. The dogs acted strange from the moment they arrived, whimpering and refusing to follow any scent trail. One of them, a German shepherd with years of experience, took one sniff of Tommy's bedroom and backed away with its hackles raised, making a sound I'd never heard from a dog before, part whine, part growl, all fear. By October, the town had begun to change. Not in any way you could point to on a map or measure with instruments, but in the way a house changes after someone dies in it. Conversation stopped when I entered the local diner. People hurried their children inside when the sun started to set. The parking lot at the Presbyterian church, usually full for Wednesday night services, stood nearly empty. And everyone was talking about the fog. Not openly, mind you. Hollow Creek folks weren't the type to admit they were scared of weather. But in whispered conversations at the post office, in the careful way people planned their errands to avoid being out after dark, in the sudden popularity of sleeping pills at Kranz's pharmacy, the truth was written plain as day. Something was wrong with our fog. I started keeping a log, noting every time the mist rolled in. At first, I thought I was imagining patterns where none existed, the way a man sees faces in clouds or hears voices in static. But the more I recorded, the clearer it became. The fog arrived precisely every 13 days, settling over the town like a blanket thrown by an unseen hand. It came without warning, defying weather patterns and meteorological predictions. One moment the air would be crystal clear, the next you couldn't see your own feet. And it had a sound. Not the ordinary whispers of moisture against leaves or the drip of condensation from eaves. This fog carried voices. Faint at first, like radio signals from a distant station, but growing clearer as the mist thickened. Voices calling names, the same names over and over again. Martha, Tommy, and others I couldn't quite make out, as if the fog held conversations from different times, different years. The third disappearance confirmed my worst fears. Elena Vasquez, 28, single mother who worked double shifts at the truck stop outside town. She'd been walking home from her evening job when the fog rolled in around 11:30 on a Thursday night. Her supervisor called me the next morning when she didn't show up for her shift. By the time I reached Elena's apartment, I knew what I'd find. The door standing slightly open, like all the others. Her purse on the counter, keys still in her hand where she dropped them. Her 4-year-old daughter asleep in the back bedroom, unaware that her mother would never come home. But this time was different. This time, I found evidence. In the soft earth of Elena's flower bed, where she'd been proud of her late-blooming marigolds, I discovered footprints. Elena's shoe prints led from the sidewalk to her front door, clear as day in the damp soil. But beside them, pressed deep into the earth, were other marks. Not quite footprints, not quite handprints. Something in between, as if whatever had made them couldn't decide what shape it wanted to hold. The prints were filled with a substance I'd never seen before, a grayish powder that felt like ash but smelled like ozone and copper pennies. When I tried to collect a sample, it dissolved between my fingers like morning frost, leaving only a tingling sensation that lasted for hours. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a bottle of bourbon and all the case files spread across my table. 3 people vanished without a trace. 3 times the fog had come calling. And each time, someone had heard their names spoken in the mist. I started asking different questions. Instead of focusing on the missing persons, I began researching the history of Hollow Creek itself. What I found in the basement of the town library made me wish I'd taken early retirement. The town records went back to 1847, when the first settlers carved their homesteads out of the wilderness. But even in those early documents, there were gaps. Census records that didn't add up. Death certificates that listed causes like took to wandering and answered the call. Family trees that ended abruptly, as if entire bloodlines had simply decided to stop existing. And there were the stories. Handwritten accounts buried in personal journals and church records, tales of strange mists that came without warning and took whoever they pleased. The town's founders had a name for it. They called it the gathering fog. They spoke of it in the same hushed tones they reserved for Indian raids and harsh winters, as if it were just another natural disaster they'd learned to live with. But the most disturbing discovery came in a water-damaged ledger from 1923. The town council had held a special meeting that October, voting unanimously to build what they called listening posts around the perimeter of Hollow Creek. Small stone structures, no bigger than tool sheds, positioned at regular intervals along the ridge lines that surrounded our valley. I'd seen those structures my whole life, assumed they were old hunting blinds or forgotten storage buildings. But according to the ledger, they'd been built for a very specific purpose: to warn the town when the gathering fog was coming. Each post was equipped with a bell and stationed with a volunteer who would ring the alarm when the mist began to form. The system had worked for decades, the records showed, keeping the disappearances to a minimum. But sometime in the 1950s, the post had been abandoned. The bells fell silent, and the fog began taking people again. I spent the next week hiking to every listening post I could find. Most had collapsed into piles of moss-covered stone, but 3 were still intact. Inside each one, I found the same thing: a bronze bell, green with age, and a logbook filled with decades of entries. The handwriting changed from person to person, but the message was always the same. Fog coming from the north. Mist rising in Dead Man's Hollow. Can hear them calling again. The final entry in the most recent logbook was dated September 15, 1954. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. It knows we're watching. It knows we're listening. God help us, it's learning our names. Below that, in different ink, someone had written, "Position abandoned. May God forgive us." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee and a loaded shotgun, though I couldn't have said what I expected to shoot. The air was still, clear as window glass, but something felt wrong. The kind of wrong you feel in your bones before an earthquake, when every animal in the county starts acting strange and the hair on your neck refuses to lie flat. Around 2 in the morning, I saw it beginning. At first, it looked like smoke from a distant fire, wisps of gray rising from the hollow where Dead Man's Creek wound through the old pine grove. But smoke rises and dissipates. This stayed low, hugging the ground, spreading outward in all directions like spilled milk. Within minutes, it had covered 3 city blocks. Within an hour, the entire town was wrapped in white silence. And then I heard my name. Not shouted or whispered, but spoken in a conversational tone, as if someone standing just out of sight was trying to get my attention. The voice was familiar yet strange, like hearing your own voice played back on an old recording. It came from everywhere and nowhere, carried on air that felt thick as cotton in my lungs. "Sheriff Mackenzie." I gripped the shotgun tighter, though every instinct told me bullets wouldn't help with whatever was calling. The fog had reached my front yard now, turning my familiar neighborhood into an alien landscape. Street lamps became dim halos of light. Houses disappeared behind walls of white. Even my own front steps looked foreign and threatening. "Sheriff Mackenzie. Time to go." The voice was closer now, though I still couldn't tell which direction it came from. I stood up slowly, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything but step off that porch. But I was the law in Hollow Creek. I'd sworn an oath to protect and serve, and 3 of my people were already gone. I stepped into the fog. The world changed the moment I crossed the threshold from clear air to mist. Sound became muffled, distorted. My footsteps on the wooden porch steps sounded like someone else walking in another room. The fog was warm against my skin, almost caressing, and it had a taste, metallic and sweet, like blood and honey mixed together. "This way, Sheriff." I followed the voice because I had no choice. My vision was reduced to maybe 3 feet in any direction, turning my hometown into a maze of half-glimpsed shapes and shadow. I walked down streets I'd patrolled for decades, but nothing looked right. Houses stood where empty lots should be. Streets curved in directions that defied the map I carried in my head. And I wasn't alone in the fog. They walked beside me, though I could never see them clearly. Shapes that might have been people, moving with purpose through the white maze. Sometimes I caught glimpses, a familiar jacket, a flash of red hair, the outline of someone I thought I recognized. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there but swirling mist. "Martha?" I called out once, when I thought I saw a figure in a blue housecoat. The shape paused, turned toward me. For just a moment, the fog cleared enough for me to see a face. It was Martha Connolly, but wrong somehow. Her features were too soft, like wet clay that hadn't quite held its shape. Her eyes were the white of fresh fog, and when she opened her mouth to speak, nothing came out but the sound of wind through empty houses. She raised one hand, or what might have been a hand, and pointed deeper into the mist. I walked for what felt like hours through that impossible landscape. The fog never thinned, never showed any sign of lifting. I passed the same corner 3 times, walked up hills that shouldn't exist in my flat hometown, crossed bridges over streams that had been paved over decades ago. The fog wasn't just changing how I saw Hollow Creek, it was changing Hollow Creek itself, reshaping reality according to some logic I couldn't understand. Eventually, I found myself in a part of town I'd never seen before, though it felt familiar in the way of childhood nightmares. The houses here were older, built in styles that predated anything in our historical records. Victorian mansions with too many windows, colonial farmhouses with additions that defied geometry, log cabins that looked like they'd been standing since before the first settlers arrived. And in every doorway, figures waited. Some I recognized, Martha, Tommy, Elena, and dozens of others whose faces I remembered from missing person reports going back decades. Others were strangers, though their clothes suggested they came from different eras. Women in long dresses and men in old-fashioned suits, children in knickers and wool stockings, all of them watching me with those white, empty eyes. None of them spoke, but I could feel their attention like a physical weight. They were waiting for something, expecting something from me. And deep in my gut I knew what it was. The voice spoke again, and this time I recognized it completely. It was my own voice, speaking words I'd never said in a tone I'd never used. "Time to choose, Sheriff. Time to join us, or time to go back. What are you?" I managed to ask, though my throat felt like it was filled with cobwebs. "We are the gathered," my own voice replied. "The ones who answered when our names were called. The ones who stepped into the fog and found our true home." A figure stepped forward from the crowd, Elena Vasquez still wearing her truck stop uniform. When she spoke, it was with that same wrong voice, words that came from everywhere at once. "We are the children of the hollow places, Sheriff. The children of the spaces between. We have been calling for so long, and so few answer. But I don't want to disappear," I said, and immediately felt foolish. What kind of lawman pleads with kidnappers? Elena's fog-white eyes seemed to focus on me with something that might have been sympathy. "Disappear?" she said, and for a moment her voice sounded almost normal. "Sheriff, we haven't disappeared. We've just moved somewhere else. Somewhere better." She gestured to the impossible neighborhood around us, the Victorian mansions and colonial farmhouses that existed only in the fog. "This is Hollow Creek as it truly is," she said. "Not the small, dying town you know, but the place it was always meant to be. The place where all the lost things gather, where all the forgotten people find their voices again." Tommy Briggs stepped out of the crowd, still 17, still wearing his leather jacket. "We can be anyone here, Sheriff. We can be everyone. All the people we might have been, all the lives we might have lived. The fog shows us what we really are." Around us, the gathered began to move closer. Not threatening, exactly, but insistent. Their white eyes reflected no light, but somehow I could see myself in them. Dozens of versions of myself, each one slightly different. Taller, shorter, younger, older. A Sheriff Mackenzie who never married, One who'd had children, one who'd left Hollow Creek for the big city, one who'd never become a cop at all. "All you have to do is say yes," Martha Connolly said, her voice layering over Elena's and Tommy's until it became a chorus. "All you have to do is let go." For a moment, I was tempted. God help me, I was actually tempted. The fog was warm and comfortable, like being wrapped in the finest blanket. The gathered looked happy, content in a way I'd never seen in the living. And the thought of returning to my empty house, my routine patrols, my dwindling years of solitude, it seemed harder than just letting the mist carry me away. But then I remembered Elena's daughter, asleep in her bed, waiting for a mother who would never come home. I thought of Martha's cat, probably dead by now from hunger and grief. I thought of Tommy's parents, who'd aged 10 years in the weeks since their son vanished. "No," I said, and my voice sounded strange in the thick air. "No, I have to go back." The gathered stopped moving. The fog itself seemed to pause, holding its breath. "Why?" Elena asked, and now there was something like genuine curiosity in her voice. "Because someone has to remember," I said. "Someone has to tell their families what happened. Someone has to warn the others." Tommy laughed, but it wasn't the sound of joy. It was the sound wind makes through broken windows. "You think they'll believe you, Sheriff? You think anyone will believe this?" He was right, of course. Who would believe an old cop's story about fog that kidnapped people and towns that existed only in the mist? They'd think I'd finally cracked, that the stress of the disappearances had driven me over the edge. But that didn't matter. "I don't care if they believe me," I said. "I just care that someone knows." The fog began to swirl faster around us, and the gathered started to fade back into the mist. Their voices came from farther away now, layered and echoing like sounds in a cathedral. "Then remember this, Sheriff Mackenzie," they said in unison. "The fog will come again. It always comes again. And next time, we'll be calling louder." The last thing I saw before the white world dissolved was Elena's face, still wearing that expression of infinite sadness and infinite peace. "Tell my daughter I love her," she whispered. "Tell her mama's in a better place." Then the fog was gone, and I was standing alone in my front yard, shotgun still in my hands, morning sun painting everything gold and normal. My coffee cup sat on the porch where I'd left it, stone cold. According to my watch, only 20 minutes had passed, though I'd walked for hours through that impossible town. I could have convinced myself it was all a dream, a nightmare brought on by stress and too much bourbon. But in the soft earth of my flower bed, where I'd apparently walked during my time in the fog, were footprints. My boot prints, clear as day. And beside them, those same strange marks I'd found at Elena's house. Not quite hands, not quite feet, but something in between. Something that wanted to be human but couldn't quite remember how. That was 3 years ago. I retired 6 months later, told everyone I was ready to spend my golden years fishing and reading. The truth is, I couldn't stand being responsible for a town I couldn't protect. How do you patrol against something that exists in the spaces between reality? How do you serve and protect when the danger comes from the very air people breathe? My replacement is a good man, young and eager, full of ideas about community policing and modern investigative techniques. I've tried to warn him, in careful ways that don't make me sound completely insane. I've told him about the fog, about the patterns I noticed, about the old listening posts on the ridge. He nods politely and makes notes, but I can see in his eyes that he thinks I'm just another old-timer spinning tall tales. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe it's better to be the local crazy man who sees monsters in the weather than to burden someone else with the truth. The fog still comes every 13 days, regular as clockwork. I've kept detailed records, mapped its movements, documented every appearance. Most of the time it's ordinary fog now, just moisture and air, nothing more dangerous than poor visibility. But sometimes, when the conditions are just right, when the moon is dark and the air is still, I can hear them calling. New names now. The fog is patient, but it's always hungry. Last month, it took the Hendricks boy, age 16, star of the debate team. 2 weeks before that, it was Sarah Mills, the librarian who'd worked in town for 30 years. The new sheriff calls them missing persons cases, files the appropriate reports, organizes search parties that find nothing. I don't participate in the searches anymore. I know they won't find anything because there's nothing left to find. The gathered have their new members, their new voices in the chorus. But I keep watching. I keep listening. And every time the fog rolls in, I lock my doors and close my windows and wait for the voices to start calling. Because I know, with the certainty that comes from having seen too much, that eventually they'll call my name again. And next time, I'm not sure I'll have the strength to say no. The fog isn't patient forever. And sometimes, on the quiet nights when the loneliness gets too heavy and the empty house feels too much like a tomb, the idea of joining the gathered doesn't seem so terrible. The idea of being part of something larger, something eternal, something that exists in all the spaces between what is and what might be. It called my name last night, clearer than it ever has before. I could hear Elena and Martha and Tommy and all the others, their voices blending together into something beautiful and terrible and irresistible. I stood at my window for an hour, watching the fog swirl through the streets, watching the shapes move within it. My hand was on the doorknob before I even realized I'd moved. But I didn't open the door. Not yet. Because someone has to remember. Someone has to keep the records. Someone has to warn the next sheriff, and the one after that, about the fog that comes every 13 days to steal away the people of Hollow Creek. But I'm 83 years old, and my hands shake more every morning. My memory isn't what it used to be, and some nights I forget why I'm so afraid of a little weather. And the fog knows I'm weakening. It can smell it on me like an old dog smells sickness. Each time it comes, the voices are a little louder, a little more persuasive. Each time, it's harder to remember why I should stay in this world instead of stepping into theirs. So I'm writing this all down, every detail I can remember, every pattern I've noticed, every warning I can think to give. I'm leaving copies with my lawyer, with the town clerk, with anyone who might listen when I'm gone. Maybe the next person who finds these records will be smarter than I was. Maybe they'll figure out how to stop it, how to break the cycle that's been going on for more than a century. Or maybe they'll just think I was a crazy old man who saw monsters in the mist. Either way, when the fog comes for me, and it will come for me, probably sooner than later, at least someone will know what happened. Someone will know why another old sheriff disappeared on a foggy night in Hollow Creek, Maine. Someone will remember that we were here, that we mattered, that we didn't just vanish into nothing. The fog is rising tonight. I can see it through my kitchen window, rolling up from the hollow like spilled milk. My watch says it's been exactly 13 days since the last time. And I can hear them calling. All of them, everyone the fog has ever taken, their voices joined together in one great chorus. Martha and Tommy and Elena and the Hendricks boy and Sarah Mills and dozens of others whose names I've forgotten or never knew. And underneath it all, threading through the other voices like a silver wire through dark cloth, I can hear my own voice calling back to me. Sheriff Mackenzie, it says. Time to come home. I'm going to finish writing this, seal it in an envelope, and leave it where someone will find it. Then I'm going to make myself a cup of coffee, sit on my front porch, and wait. Because I'm tired of running from the fog. I'm tired of being afraid of something I don't understand. And I'm tired of being the only one who remembers the people we've lost. Maybe it's time to stop being the one who remembers and start being one of the remembered. Maybe it's time to see what Hollow Creek really looks like when you're not afraid to step into the mist. The fog is at my front yard now. I can see shapes moving in it, familiar faces with white, empty eyes. They're waiting for me, patient as death, patient as time itself. And for the first time in 3 years, I'm not afraid. I'm going to open the door now. I'm going to step off this porch and into the fog and see what's been waiting for me all this time. If you're reading this, remember us. Remember that we were here, that we had names and lives and people who loved us. Remember that Hollow Creek was a real place with real people, not just another story about things that go bump in the night. And if the fog ever comes to your town, if you ever hear your name being called from the white silence, remember this. Some invitations are easier to accept than to refuse. Some calls are too beautiful to ignore. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The fog is calling my name now, and this time, I'm going to answer. End of recording. Note found by maintenance staff in the abandoned residence of former Sheriff James McKenzie, Hollow Creek, Maine. Date of discovery, October 13, 2023. Current whereabouts of Sheriff McKenzie, unknown.